The cum/tend of the Providentary was working, and the stup-like type percentes. Before I share what happened to us in the autumn of 2023, I need to tell you something. I have spent the last several months trying to process the events that unfolded across those ancient ridges and dense forests. The recordings we made, the photographs we took, none of them captured what our eyes truly witnessed. What technology cannot preserve, I will attempt to convey through words. My name is not what matters here. What matters is that I was there. I was present when the boundary between our world and another reality became dangerously thin. This is not a campfire story meant to entertain. This is documentation. This is testimony. And if you listen to these words carefully, you may come to understand why some places on this earth remain untouched and unexplored, not because we lack the capability to venture into them, but because something within those places has learned to discourage our presence. The mountains of Appalachia are ancient. They have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the movement of peoples, and the persistence of things that should not exist, and yet they persist still. The planning stages for our expedition had consumed nearly 6 months of preparation. Our team consisted of 20 individuals, all passionate about wilderness exploration and the documentation of remote territories. Lucas Wright, who served as our primary guide, had traversed these mountains more times than any of us could count. At 25 years old, he possessed a kind of intimate knowledge about the terrain that went beyond maps and topography. He understood the mountains in a way that suggested he had been born into their rhythms. We gathered at the base camp on a Friday evening in late September. The autumn air carried the first significant chill of the season, and the leaves had begun their transformation into amber and crimson. Mia Scott, our logistics coordinator and one of the oldest members of our expedition at 26, worked tirelessly to ensure that every piece of equipment had been accounted for and properly distributed among the team. She maintained meticulous records of supplies, water purification tablets, emergency medical kits, and portable communication devices. Henry Green, at 27 years old, brought his expertise in environmental documentation. He operated our primary recording equipment and had become instrumental in capturing the visual elements of our journey. Beside him worked Charlotte Baker, our nutritionist and food supply specialist, ensuring that our meals would sustain us through the demanding physical activity ahead. Charlotte was 28 and possessed a methodical approach to every task she undertook. Alexander Adams, our designated backup guide at 29, had partnered with Lucas on several previous excursions. Together, they had developed a communication system specific to their route selections and navigation choices. Amelia Nelson, our botanist at 30 years old, intended to document the plant species present in various elevations throughout our journey. Her botanical expertise would allow us to understand the ecosystem we were entering. Daniel Hill, a trained wilderness specialist at 31, coordinated with Mia on safety protocols and emergency response procedures. He had seen situations in the wilderness that had forced him to remain calm under extraordinary pressure. Harper Mitchell, at 32 years old, served as our communications specialist. She maintained our satellite uplinks and ensured that we could contact the outside world if necessary, though our path would eventually take us beyond the range of most technological conveniences. Matthew Roberts, our expedition's historian at 33 years old, had researched the folklore and cultural significance of the Appalachian region. He had prepared briefings about the history of the mountains and the peoples who had inhabited them across generations. Evelyn Turner, the eldest member of our party at 34 years old, provided what could only be described as maternal oversight. She noticed when team members became fatigued and ensured that everyone maintained adequate hydration and nutrition. The Appalachian Mountains stretched before us in an undulating terrain of densely forested slopes and narrow valleys. Our planned route would take us through areas rarely visited by modern explorers, territories where cell phone signals became sporadic and eventually non-existent. We would be reliant upon ourselves and our training. Lucas gathered everyone at sunset that first evening. The sky had transformed into shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the camp. He explained our route with careful precision, pointing out landmarks that would guide us through the initial phase of our expedition. He mentioned certain areas that we should avoid, regions he described as unsuitable for camping due to unstable ground and unpredictable water conditions. His tone seemed to carry more weight than simple geographical concerns, but when asked directly about the reasoning, He deflected with explanations about soil composition and seasonal flooding patterns. That night, we settled into our tents as darkness consumed the landscape. The sounds of the forest at night are unlike anything most people experience in modern life. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, the wind moving through countless trees created a symphony that was both beautiful and somewhat unsettling. I found myself lying awake in my sleeping bag, listening to these sounds and wondering what nocturnal creatures operated beneath the cover of darkness. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I became aware of a sound that did not fit the natural patterns of the forest. It was something between a howl and a scream, a vocalization that seemed to carry an intelligence that animal sounds typically lack. I sat upright in my tent, uncertain whether what I heard was real or a product of my half-asleep mind. When the sound came again, closer this time, I knew it was genuine. The next morning, I asked others about what they had heard during the night. Most of them reported hearing nothing unusual, sleeping through the darkness without disturbance. Only Charlotte mentioned that she had heard something strange around the same time, though she described it differently than I did. She had heard what she believed to be an animal call, something that might have been a coyote or a large cat. Lucas, when I brought the matter to his attention, simply nodded. He suggested that large predators occasionally pass through the region and that we should all be mindful of keeping our camp organized and secured. He advised us to make noise while hiking and to avoid traveling alone at any point during the expedition. His suggestions were practical and grounded, yet there remained something in his expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying. We broke camp at dawn, our 20-person team organized into a single-file line, stretching across the forest trail like a chain of determined explorers. The weight of our pack settled onto our shoulders as we began the ascent into the higher elevations. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of earth and pine. The forest around us seemed primeval, untouched by the modern world despite the hiking trail beneath our feet. By midday, we had covered approximately 8 miles of terrain. Our pace was steady but not rushed, allowing everyone to maintain the expedition without excessive physical strain. We stopped at a predetermined location beside a clear mountain stream, where we ate lunch and refilled our water supplies. Daniel checked everyone for signs of physical distress or injury, making notes in his medical log. Everyone reported feeling well, though the physical demands of the hike had begun to manifest in tired muscles and sore feet. That afternoon, as we continued deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice something that seemed to follow the periphery of our group. There was movement in the trees at times that did not correspond to the wind. Branches seemed to shift and move in ways that suggested a presence moving parallel to our route. When I pointed this out to those nearby, they assured me it was likely wildlife reacting to our presence. Yet the movement seemed too coordinated, too purposeful to be the random behavior of startled animals. By the time we selected our second campsite, the sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. We had covered approximately 12 miles from our starting point. As the team worked to establish the camp, collecting water and preparing the evening meal, I noticed that Lucas and Alexander were having a conversation in hushed tones away from the main group. Their body language suggested tension, a disagreement of some kind. When they noticed me observing them, they separated quickly, and Lucas approached the group to make a general announcement. He informed everyone that we would be adjusting our route slightly tomorrow. Certain trails were becoming more difficult than anticipated, and he wanted to redirect our path to ensure optimal safety and accessibility for all team members. The adjustment would add perhaps 1 additional day to our expedition, but it was necessary. He presented this explanation with confidence and authority, and most of the team accepted it without question. However, I found myself wondering if the route adjustment had more to do with Lucas's concerns about whatever he had not disclosed at the beginning of our expedition. That evening, as I settled into my tent once again, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that we were being observed, not by another human, but by something else, something that moved through the forest with purpose and intention. The second day of our expedition brought with it a change in the forest itself. The trees seemed to press closer to the trail, their branches interwoven in patterns that created a natural tunnel of foliage above our heads. The light that filtered through this canopy was dim and green, giving everything an otherworldly appearance. The temperature had dropped noticeably, despite the physical exertion of hiking, and more than one team member commented on the sudden chill. Amelia, our botanist, made detailed observations of the plant life around us. She noted that certain species of moss and fungal growths were more prevalent here than they should have been, given the climate conditions. The unusual distribution suggested something about the soil chemistry or perhaps the moisture levels that seemed distinct from the surrounding forest. She spent approximately 1 hour documenting various specimens while the rest of the team waited on the trail. Her findings would later seem prescient, though at the moment they merely seemed like the meticulous work of a thorough professional. By mid-morning, Matthew had begun sharing some of the historical and folklore information he had researched about the region. He spoke about the Cherokee peoples who had inhabited these mountains, their deep spiritual connection to the land, and the stories they had preserved about entities that inhabited the deeper forests. He mentioned in particular a being that the Cherokee referred to by several names, each one suggesting something that could change form and assume different appearances. He presented this information in an academic manner, treating it as historical curiosity and cultural documentation rather than warning. Yet Lucas interrupted Matthew during one of these discussions. He suggested that perhaps we should focus more on our immediate route and less on folklore that might make people nervous or apprehensive. His interruption was pointed and sharp, clearly indicating that he did not want this particular subject to be discussed among the group. Matthew, understanding the social dynamics, dropped the topic and fell back to his position in the line. Midway through the second day, one of our team members, a younger man named Devin, who had been quiet and unobtrusive for most of the expedition, began falling behind the group. He complained of pain in his left leg, possibly a strained muscle or minor injury incurred during the first day of hiking. Daniel examined his leg at the next break and determined that the injury was minor but would benefit from rest. Lucas made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time but would later appear in a different light. He suggested that Devin return to the base camp with one of our team members who would accompany him back out of the wilderness. This would reduce our party by 2 individuals. The remaining 18 of us would continue forward and reconvene at a predetermined location 3 days hence. Devin and his escort departed within the hour, heading back the way we had come. It was our first reduction in numbers, and I noticed that Lucas seemed relieved by Devin's departure. He even seemed more at ease once the 2 had disappeared from sight down the trail. This struck me as unusual. Any reasonable guide should feel some responsibility for all team members and might express concern about Devin's condition or guilt about his departure. Instead, Lucas demonstrated what appeared to be visible relief. As we continued forward that afternoon, the forest around us had become noticeably more hostile in appearance. The trees were gnarled and twisted, growing at odd angles as though they had been struggling against unseen forces. Dead wood lay across the forest floor in chaotic patterns. The overall appearance suggested an environment under some kind of stress, though I could not identify what might cause such conditions. More significantly, we began to observe evidence of what might have been animal kills. The remains were not fresh, but they appeared scattered throughout the forest in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Bones were arranged in ways that did not seem entirely random. Some appeared to have been positioned in ritualistic arrangements. When Mia brought this to Lucas's attention, he simply stated that predators in the area must be particularly active and suggested we maintain heightened awareness. That evening, as darkness descended upon the camp, the sounds we heard were distinctly different from the previous night. The animal calls seemed more numerous, and they contained an intensity that suggested agitation or alarm. I found myself thinking about the scattered bones we had observed throughout the day. I wondered what might have caused such distress in the local wildlife population. Around the same time as the night before, approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard the sound again. But this time it was not distant. This time it was much, much closer. The vocalization came from somewhere beyond the perimeter of our camp, perhaps 100 feet away at most. It was a sound that seemed to split the difference between human speech and animal howl, a noise that contained almost articulate qualities that made it profoundly disturbing in ways that I struggle to articulate even now. I heard movement throughout the camp as others awakened at the sound. The call came again, and this time it was answered from a different direction. We had multiple entities surrounding our camp, calling to one another in a manner that suggested coordination and purpose. Henry, our documentary specialist, began recording the sounds with our audio equipment. Whatever these creatures were, their vocalizations represented something that should be documented and studied. Lucas emerged from his tent and immediately instructed everyone to remain calm and remain within their tents. He moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, checking our perimeter and ensuring that our fire was extinguished to reduce any ambient light that might provide a clear target for whatever was investigating us. His demeanor had changed significantly. The casual confidence he had displayed during daylight hours had been replaced by a focused concentration that spoke to someone who understood the danger we were facing. The surrounding sounds continued for approximately 30 minutes, the creatures moving around our camp, occasionally calling out to one another in their strange language. Their presence was heavy and palpable. I found myself holding my breath, listening to every sound, every movement in the darkness beyond our tents. The noise eventually diminished as dawn approached, the creatures apparently departing with the coming light. When we emerged from our tents at first light, the overall mood of the camp had changed dramatically. The sense of adventure and excitement that had characterized the first day had been replaced by a more measured wariness. Team members spoke in quieter tones. More than one person expressed concern about continuing the expedition, suggesting that we should return to the base camp and consult with local authorities about the creatures we had heard. Lucas gathered us together and made a statement that seemed carefully calculated to maintain our confidence while acknowledging the reality of what we had experienced. He explained that we had likely heard a pack of coyotes or possibly feral dogs. Such animals often sound far more menacing at night than they actually are. The important thing was that they had not approached the camp directly, and our established safety protocols had protected us. He suggested that additional noise during the night watch might discourage any further visits. Several team members seemed to accept this explanation. Others, particularly Henry, who had recorded the sounds, seemed skeptical. The vocalizations he had captured did not match any sound database he had access to through our portable equipment. Yet with no clear alternative explanation, and with Lucas's assurances that this was a normal part of wilderness expeditions in remote territory, we prepared to continue forward. That morning, as we broke camp and resumed our journey, I found myself paying more attention to the forest around us, and I began to see evidence that Lucas had been right to adjust our route. The areas that we were now avoiding, the territories that I could see through gaps in the forest to our left and right, contained physical characteristics that seemed actively dangerous. Trees had been uprooted as though by tremendous force. Entire sections of forest floor appeared disturbed and overturned. Stone formations had been broken and scattered in patterns that suggested explosive or violent energy. If Devon had remained with us, and if Lucas had not adjusted our route, we would have been traveling directly through these areas today. The realization was sobering. Lucas had not simply made a guide's practical decision to optimize our route. He had been actively avoiding specific territories that he believed were dangerous, and his knowledge of why those territories were dangerous seemed to go far beyond simple geological or meteorological concerns. By the third day of our expedition, we had traveled sufficiently deep into the wilderness that the outside world seemed like a distant memory. Our satellite communication equipment still functioned, but Harper, our communication specialist, reported that the signal quality was degrading. Eventually, we would lose contact with the outside world entirely. This was something we had anticipated and prepared for, but now that it was imminent, the reality of our isolation seemed to weigh more heavily upon us. The terrain around us had become increasingly difficult to navigate. We were now traveling along ridgelines where the elevation exceeded 4,000 feet. The air was noticeably thinner, and the physical demands of the hike had increased substantially. More team members began to experience fatigue and minor physical distress. Evelyn, our eldest team member, had begun to struggle with the sustained physical exertion. Daniel monitored her carefully, ensuring that she was receiving adequate rest and hydration. Midday on the third day, we stopped at a location that Lucas identified as a critical waypoint in our journey. He explained that beyond this point, the forest would become increasingly dense and the trail would become less distinct. The area around us demonstrated a natural clearing, a space where the trees retreated and allowed sunlight to penetrate to the forest floor. It was a location that felt safer, more open, and less oppressive than the dense corridors of vegetation we had been traveling through. During our extended rest at this location, Matthew brought forth some additional historical information that he felt compelled to share. He explained that this particular region of the Appalachian Mountains had been the site of numerous historical incidents that were poorly documented and inadequately explained. There were accounts of explorers and settlers who had traveled into these mountains and simply disappeared without trace. Some had been found, but in circumstances that defied simple explanation. Their remains showed evidence of trauma that seemed inconsistent with any known animal predation. Some had been found in locations that they would have been unlikely to travel to given the direction they had been headed. Matthew presented this information carefully, clearly aware of Lucas's previous objection to folklore and historical discussions that might generate fear. However, he argued that as a historical documentation, this information was relevant to understanding the region we were exploring. More importantly, he suggested that certain accounts from indigenous populations had preserved warnings about specific areas of these mountains that were considered dangerous or prohibited. Some of these warnings had persisted in local culture even to the present day. Mia asked directly whether Lucas was aware of any such warnings or prohibitions. Lucas responded that he was aware of local folklore and superstitions, but that such matters were not relevant to our expedition. We were modern explorers with appropriate equipment, training, and safety protocols. Historical fears and indigenous warnings, while culturally significant, should not dictate our route selection. Our decisions would continue to be based on practical considerations of terrain, distance, and logistics. Yet I noticed that this response from Lucas contained a quality of defensiveness that had not been present in his previous communications. He seemed to be attempting to convince himself as much as us that the folklore was irrelevant, and his insistence on ignoring these warnings struck me as potentially dangerous. The assertion that modern training and equipment could overcome whatever the indigenous peoples of these mountains had felt compelled to warn against. That afternoon, as we prepared to resume our journey, Henry approached me with a question that had been troubling him. He wondered whether the sounds we had heard the previous night matched the characteristics of known animals. He had processed the audio recordings through various analysis tools and had compared them to extensive databases of animal vocalizations. The sounds we had recorded did not match any known species. They seemed to fall into a category unto themselves, neither fully canine nor feline, nor indeed anything that existed in any standard reference material. I asked him what he thought this meant. He expressed uncertainty but suggested that perhaps we were encountering an animal species that had not been formally documented or studied by scientific means. Appalachia contained vast territories where exotic species might exist undetected by the broader scientific community. It was possible, he suggested, that we were encountering something genuinely unknown to modern zoology. As the afternoon progressed, our route began to descend into a valley that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight. The trees were so densely packed that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. The air grew noticeably colder, and a sense of oppression seemed to press down upon us. The trail beneath our feet became increasingly uncertain, and in several locations, Lucas had to pause and examine the terrain carefully to determine our exact path. It was in one of these pauses that I heard something that stopped my breath. Ahead of us on the trail, perhaps 50 feet away, I observed movement. A figure appeared to step across the trail, moving from right to left in a smooth, almost liquid motion. My initial impression was of a person, but something about the movement seemed wrong. The proportions were off. The gait did not match human biomechanics. The figure crossed the trail and disappeared into the trees on the far side. I immediately alerted Lucas and the team members nearest to me. Lucas reacted with visible tension, moving to the front of the group and instructing everyone to halt. He peered into the forest where the figure had disappeared, his hand hovering near a knife at his belt. He called out into the darkness, a hailing call meant to identify ourselves as human and potentially to communicate with whatever had been on the trail. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the trees beyond the trail, there came a response. It was not an echo of Lucas's call. It was a different vocalization, something that acknowledged his hailing call, while refusing to engage in direct communication. The sound was deliberately evasive, suggesting intelligence and intention. Lucas gathered the group quickly and made a decision that would alter the course of our expedition. He announced that we would make camp immediately at this location, abandoning the day's remaining hiking distance. We would establish security protocols and prepare for what he described as a defensive posture. He did not explicitly explain what we were defending ourselves against, but his implications were clear enough. As we established the camp, working quickly in the dimming light, I approached Lucas and demanded clarification about what we were actually facing. What was the creature that had crossed the trail? What were the sounds we had been hearing? What dangers was he protecting us from? Lucas initially resisted my questions, but when I pressed him forcefully, he finally provided partial answers. He explained that the region we were now entering was home to a predator that was known to indigenous peoples by various names. It was a creature that was intelligent, territorial, and particularly active during autumn. It hunted methodically and seemed to target humans as a preferred prey item during certain seasons. It had a reputation for being nearly impossible to kill using conventional weapons, and for having sensory abilities that exceeded those of humans by substantial margins. I asked him why he had allowed our expedition to enter a region inhabited by such a creature. He responded that the danger was not absolute and varied depending on location and season. He believed he could navigate us through the region without direct confrontation, avoiding the territories where the creature was most active. However, our presence had apparently been noticed, and the creature had begun tracking our group. This made avoidance less likely, and direct confrontation increasingly possible. The atmosphere in the camp that evening was markedly different from previous nights. No one attempted to engage in casual conversation. Meals were consumed in silence. Team members checked and rechecked their equipment, uncertain what weapons or tools might actually prove effective against an unknown predator. The perimeter of the camp was marked with rope and tripwires that had been part of our equipment contingencies but had never been expected to be used. As darkness fell, we established a watch rotation. Multiple team members would remain awake throughout the night, monitoring the perimeter and maintaining awareness of any threats that approached. Lucas supervised the assignments and established specific protocols for responding to various threats. If anyone saw movement approaching the camp, they were to alert the others immediately. If there was an actual breach of the perimeter, we would attempt to repel the intruder with whatever means were available. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat with Daniel during his watch shift, both of us staring into the darkness beyond our camp, listening to every sound. The forest around us seemed to be breathing, the darkness itself seeming to possess a quality of presence. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard the creature again, but this time it was not distant. It was moving through the forest immediately surrounding our camp, circling us as though assessing our strength and determination. The creature called out multiple times, each vocalization seeming to probe our defenses, attempting to provoke a response. No one fired weapons. No one attempted to leave the camp. We remained still and silent, presenting a unified appearance of strength even though internally we were terrified. The creature's vocalizations eventually ceased, and the thing withdrew into the forest. Whether it was satisfied with what it had learned about us or whether it was simply continuing its hunt in other directions remained unclear. But as dawn approached, I found myself profoundly grateful that the night had not brought a direct confrontation. The 4th day of our expedition began under a heavy fog that seemed to rise from the valley floor and obscure everything beyond arm's length. Visibility was reduced to perhaps 30 feet in any direction, creating an environment that was simultaneously isolating and oppressive. Lucas made the decision to remain in place for the morning, allowing the fog to dissipate before we attempted to travel. Moving through such conditions while being tracked by a predator seemed unwise, and I found myself appreciating his caution. During this enforced stillness, Harper made a troubling announcement. Our satellite communication equipment had finally lost signal. We were now completely isolated from the outside world. There was no possibility of calling for rescue, no ability to contact base camp or emergency services. We were entirely dependent upon our own resources and capabilities to survive whatever lay ahead. This realization seemed to crystallize something in the minds of several team members. The situation had shifted from an adventurous expedition into something far more serious, something approaching genuine survival. Mia began conducting an inventory of our supplies and resources. We had sufficient food for approximately 5 additional days of moderate rationing. Our water supplies could be augmented through collection and purification at natural sources. Our medical supplies were adequate for treating most injuries, though anything serious would likely prove fatal given our isolation. Our weapons consisted primarily of hunting knives and a few firearms that had been packed with ammunition, though their effectiveness against an unknown predator remained uncertain. It was during this inventory that one of our team members, a woman named Sophie who had been quiet and somewhat withdrawn throughout the expedition, began to express panic about our situation. She demanded that we immediately abandon the expedition and attempt to return to base camp. She argued that her continued participation was voluntary and that she should be allowed to leave. Lucas responded that anyone who wished to attempt the return journey was free to do so, but he strongly recommended against such an action. The creature would be more active during our departure and would likely view a smaller group as a more manageable target than our larger collective. Sophie insisted nonetheless. She began gathering her equipment, preparing to depart. Evelyn, with her maternal authority, attempted to dissuade her, but Sophie was resolute. Ultimately, Lucas allowed her to depart, and Henry voluntarily accompanied her, explaining that he needed to return the sensitive recording equipment to the base camp for proper storage. This would have been his departure opportunity if he had chosen it, but he could have remained. The fact that he chose to leave seemed to suggest that his analysis of the situation had concluded that our expedition faced genuinely serious danger. Sophie and Henry departed the camp around 10 in the morning, heading back along the trail we had traveled to reach this point. Lucas did not watch them leave. He did not express concern or regret. Instead, he seemed to focus more intently on the remaining members of our group, as though reducing our numbers had been a predetermined goal. This thought troubled me significantly. I considered whether Lucas had been deliberately positioning our expedition to arrive at precisely the reduced numbers we now possessed. By midday, the fog had begun to lift, though visibility remained impaired compared to the first 2 days of the expedition. The temperature had dropped further, and frost was visible on the vegetation in areas where the fog had rested. The overall environment suggested that we had reached an elevation and a season where the weather could change rapidly and dramatically. Proper clothing and shelter would be increasingly important as we continued. Lucas announced that we would need to modify our original expedition plan. The remaining members of our party would now focus on reaching a specific location that he described as a natural shelter, a cave system that would provide protection from weather and visibility advantages for observation and defense. The route to this location would require us to traverse some difficult terrain, but it represented our best opportunity for safety given the circumstances. As we resumed our journey in early afternoon, the sounds of the forest around us seemed to change character. Instead of the normal ambient noise of wildlife, there was a quality of silence. Birds seemed to have abandoned the region. Small animals made no noises. It was as though the entire ecosystem was holding its breath in the presence of the predator that stalked the area. Then, as we were climbing a particularly steep section of trail, we heard sounds from behind us on the path. It was unmistakably the sounds of running, of something moving rapidly toward our location. Lucas immediately ordered the group off the trail, instructing everyone to move laterally into the trees and climb to higher ground. We scrambled up a slope, our feet slipping on loose stone and damp vegetation, our hands grasping at branches and roots to pull ourselves upward. Behind us, we heard crashing sounds as something pursued the path we had abandoned. But the sounds shifted direction, following us as we moved through the forest. Lucas came to a halt near the top of a ridge and instructed everyone to form a defensive perimeter, back to back, facing outward. We drew whatever weapons we possessed and prepared for what seemed to be an inevitable confrontation. The creature emerged from the trees below us, and for the first time, we had a clear, extended view of it. I struggle even now to provide an accurate description, as my mind seems to resist fully forming the image into coherent memory. What I can say with certainty is that it was large, easily the size of a large gray wolf, but with proportions that were deeply wrong. Its body seemed to shift slightly as we observed it, as though the physical form was not quite stable, not entirely committed to a single shape. The creature's head was the most disturbing element. It possessed eyes that reflected our gaze with unsettling intelligence. The mouth contained far more teeth than any natural animal should possess, and when it opened to vocalize, the sound that emerged seemed to bypass the normal process of hearing and instead generated a sensation that was almost painful, a vibration that seemed to resonate through our bodies rather than through our ears. The thing did not charge directly. Instead, it paced at the edge of our defensive formation, clearly assessing our strength and searching for weakness. It moved with a predator's precision, every muscle controlled and purposeful. At one point, it seemed to directly meet my gaze, and in that moment, I felt something more than simple animal predation. There was intelligence there, and there was something that might have been amusement, as though the creature was enjoying the moment of terror we were experiencing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and withdrew into the forest. It did not flee in panic. It simply ceased its approach and disappeared, leaving us in a state of shocked disbelief. We had come face to face with the thing that had been stalking us, and we had survived the encounter. Some of us, specifically Amelia, had suffered minor injuries during our scramble up the ridge, but nothing serious. Yet I suspect that all of us were profoundly changed by what we had witnessed. Lucas made the decision to abandon our planned defensive shelter in favor of moving immediately to the cave system he had mentioned earlier. We would travel through the night if necessary, maintaining rapid progress toward this location. He estimated it was approximately 5 hours of difficult hiking away. In our current state of heightened alert and adrenaline, he believed we could cover that distance before complete darkness made travel impossible. What followed was one of the most grueling experiences of the expedition. We moved through the forest at a pace that bordered on reckless, frequently losing the trail entirely and having to pause while Lucas oriented himself using his knowledge of the terrain and the position of the sun. The creature did not reappear, but its presence seemed to follow us nonetheless. We could sense it in the silence of the forest, in the awareness that we were being tracked and monitored. We reached the cave system just as the last light of day was fading from the sky. The cave entrance was larger than I had anticipated, an opening in the hillside that seemed to exhale cool, damp air even from several feet away. Lucas used his flashlight to examine the interior, ensuring that the immediate entrance chamber was empty and that no creature had already claimed this space as a shelter. The cave interior was remarkable. The entrance chamber opened into a space that was perhaps 40 feet wide and 20 feet tall, with walls of gray stone that had been smoothed by water over countless millennia. A small stream ran through the rear of the chamber, providing fresh water. The overall characteristics made it an ideal shelter, far better than any camp we could have constructed in the open forest. We established our camp in the cave entrance, positioning ourselves where we could see any approach but also where we had natural walls providing protection from behind and on the sides. We built a small fire, the smoke drifting up and out through the cave opening, carrying away the visible signs of our presence while also providing light and warmth. As the night settled in completely, the reality of our situation became clearer. We had encountered a predator that we could not kill and that could not be reasoned with or deterred. We were trapped in the wilderness with this creature, and our only options were to either remain hidden until it lost interest in us or to somehow neutralize the threat. Our weapons seemed hopelessly inadequate, and our knowledge of the creature was minimal. It was Matthew who, during the long darkness of that night, finally provided context for what we were facing. He explained that according to various indigenous traditions preserved in the region, the creature we were encountering matched the characteristics of what was known by different names depending on the specific cultural origin of the account. To the Cherokee, it had been described as something that could shift its form, that could move between the world of spirits and the world of flesh with relative ease. To other cultures, it was remembered as something that had once been human but had been transformed through actions that placed it outside the boundaries of normal existence. These accounts spoke of the creature's intelligence, its ability to understand human speech and behavior, and its apparent pleasure in hunting human prey. Importantly, they also described certain vulnerabilities and practices that might provide protection or defense. It was suggested that the creature could not easily enter spaces that had been sanctified or blessed, that certain symbols and practices carried power against it, and that its ability to approach might be limited by the strength and unity of those it sought to harm. Lucas did not dismiss these accounts as mere folklore this time. Instead, he asked Matthew to elaborate in detail on every protective practice he had research documentation for. It became clear that Lucas had likely known about these traditional protections all along and had been hoping we would not need to employ them. The fact that we now needed them suggested that the situation had escalated beyond what he had anticipated. Over the course of that night, we implemented the protective practices that Matthew described. We created a perimeter of ash around the interior of the cave, a line that was supposed to limit the creature's ability to cross. We arranged stones in patterns that Matthew described as having protective significance. We carved symbols into the dirt floor, symbols that he claimed had been used by indigenous peoples to establish boundaries against such entities. None of this seemed particularly rational or scientific, yet we were beyond the realm of rational and scientific responses. We were attempting to survive an encounter with something that science did not acknowledge existed. Our options were limited to either accepting the efficacy of these traditional practices or accepting that we were likely to die in this cave. As the night progressed, the creature returned. We heard its vocalizations outside the cave, heard the sounds of its movement in the darkness beyond our reach. It circled the cave entrance repeatedly, occasionally approaching close enough that we could see its shape silhouetted against the darkness, but it did not enter. Whether this was because of the protective measures we had implemented, or because the cave entrance itself provided defensive advantages that made direct approach unwise, remained unclear. The creature seemed frustrated by the barrier we presented. It howled and snarled, its vocalizations rising in intensity and desperation. The sounds were deeply disturbing, creating a visceral sense of menace that no amount of rational analysis could overcome. The thing wanted to reach us, wanted access to our shelter, and was clearly unhappy about the obstruction. Then, near what we calculated to be around 3 a.m, the creature's behavior changed. Instead of circling and vocalizing, it began to approach the cave entrance in a methodical fashion. It moved with deliberate purpose toward the line of ash we had created, and then, in a moment that seemed to defy all rational explanation, it stopped. It came to a halt at the boundary line and would not cross it. The creature examined the line of ash intently, almost seeming to study it with intelligence and purpose. It moved along the line, testing it in various locations, searching for weakness or gaps, but it would not cross. The protective perimeter we had constructed was functioning. The creature, for all its intelligence and predatory capability, was bound by rules that prevented it from breaking through the barrier we had established. As dawn approached, the creature retreated, but unlike the previous day, its retreat seemed less like a strategic withdrawal and more like something that resembled reluctant acceptance. It was still present in the forest around us, still watching and waiting, but it could not reach us while we maintained the sanctuary of the cave and the protective boundaries. During that day, which we spent in relative safety, I found myself sitting with Alexander Adams near the cave entrance. Alexander had been quiet throughout most of the expedition, more of an observer than a participant in most conversations. When I asked him directly about his thoughts regarding our situation, he responded with the perspective of someone who had seen things in the wilderness that most people would never encounter. He explained that he believed the creature we were facing operated according to rules and limitations that we could use to our advantage. It was not an unstoppable force. It was a predator, and like all predators, it had evolved to operate within a specific environment and according to specific behavioral patterns. These patterns could be learned, could be understood, and could potentially be exploited. He suggested that if we could determine what limitations bound the creature, we might be able to use those limitations to escape the wilderness and return to base camp. The protective measures we had implemented in the cave were clearly having an effect. Perhaps there were other locations or circumstances that would provide similar safety. Perhaps by understanding the rules that governed the creature's behavior, we could chart a path that kept us beyond its reach. The remaining days of our expedition became a careful dance of movement and concealment. By day, we would travel along routes that provided the most natural protection, moving along exposed ridgelines where the creature could not approach without being clearly visible, or through caves and rock formations that seemed to inhibit its approach. By night, we would establish protective perimeters similar to the one we had created in the main cave, using ash and symbolic markers to establish sanctuaries that the creature would not breach. Daniel and I conducted a careful analysis of each location where the creature appeared and each location where it did not approach. A pattern emerged. The creature seemed reluctant to cross water. It avoided locations where sunlight penetrated directly, preferring movement through shadow and dense forest. It seemed to have particular difficulty with certain types of terrain, places where the earth itself seemed to resist its presence. Most significantly, we noted that the creature's confidence and aggression seemed to wane as we moved higher in elevation, and as we moved toward areas that showed evidence of human activity, even ancient human activity. The cave we had sheltered in had contained markings that Matthew identified as being of considerable age, possibly more than a century old based on the erosion patterns. These marks seemed to have the same symbolic power as the marks we had created, suggesting that people had been protecting themselves against this creature for centuries. On what we calculated to be the 6th day of the expedition, we encountered evidence that would change our understanding of the entire situation. We had been traveling along a ridgeline when we came across the remains of another person. The skeleton had been exposed for some time, the bones partially scattered, but the clothing and artifacts around it suggested the remains were perhaps a decade old. Among the remains was a journal, its pages preserved in reasonable condition despite the passage of time. The journal documented an expedition similar to our own, a team of wilderness explorers who had entered the mountains and had encountered the creature. but their encounter had been far more tragic than ours. Their group had split up, and several members had not survived. The final entries in the journal, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, documented the author's conviction that the creature could not be escaped, that it would pursue them even after they left the mountains, that the protection of the cave would only provide temporary refuge. The journal ended abruptly, the final entry incomplete. We found no remains of the person who had written the journal, no indication of what had become of them after the final written words. But the existence of these remains and this documentation provided confirmation that what we were experiencing was not a singular event, but rather a pattern, one that had repeated across decades and potentially centuries. Lucas seemed particularly affected by this discovery. He spent considerable time examining the remains and reading and rereading the journal entries. I approached him afterward and asked directly whether he had known about previous expeditions that had encountered the creature. He was silent for a long moment before responding that he had heard rumors and stories, but he had not known of specific documentation like the journal we had found. I asked him whether he should have disclosed this knowledge before leading our expedition into the mountains. He responded that his knowledge had been incomplete and based largely on folklore and speculation. He had believed that with proper preparation and careful route planning, we could navigate through the region without direct confrontation. The fact that the creature had taken active interest in our group suggested that something about our specific expedition had drawn its attention in ways that previous groups had not experienced. This response was not entirely satisfying, but given the circumstances and given that we had survived where others had not, I chose not to press the matter further. We ceremonially buried the remains we had found and left the journal in place, deciding that it would serve as a memorial and as a warning to any future expeditions that might venture into this region. On the 7th day of the expedition, as we calculated our position and our remaining distance to base camp, we made a decision that would define the final phase of our journey. Instead of attempting to follow our original planned route or attempting to find the most direct path back to base camp, we would follow the path of the mountain ridgelines, maintaining elevation and seeking out locations that seemed to inhibit the creature's approach. Lucas explained that the mountains themselves seemed to be divided into territories. The lower valleys, the dense forests, and certain regions of the mountain system were places where the creature held dominion and where it was most active and powerful. The higher elevations, the exposed ridgelines, and the places that received more consistent sunlight seemed to be locations where its influence was weaker. By traveling along these routes, we would limit its ability to approach us and would maximize our chances of reaching base camp without catastrophic loss of life. The travel along these routes was physically demanding in ways that surpassed our initial expedition. The terrain was steep and exposed, the weather was increasingly unpredictable, and our food supplies were becoming dangerously depleted. But with each hour of travel along these routes, I felt a sense of increasing confidence that we would actually make it out of the mountains alive. The creature followed us, of course. We could see it occasionally in the valleys below us, pacing parallel to our route, monitoring our progress, but it seemed increasingly frustrated by its inability to reach us. Its vocalizations, when they came, sounded less confident, less like the assured predator, and more like something that was becoming aware that its prey was slipping beyond its reach. Near the point where we were approaching the boundaries of the expedition territory and moving back toward areas of human habitation, the creature made one final approach. It was late afternoon, and we were traversing a narrow ridge that provided limited protection or escape routes. The creature appeared below us on the slope and began a methodical climb toward our location. But at that moment, something unexpected occurred. From somewhere beyond our immediate perception, we heard voices, human voices. People were approaching, calling out, apparently part of a search and rescue operation. It seemed that even though Harper's satellite communication had failed, enough of our expedition had made it back to base camp that authorities had initiated a search for the missing members of our party. The creature, confronted with the approaching human voices and the imminent arrival of additional humans, made its choice. It turned away from us and descended back into the forests below. Whether it was responding to fear of the additional humans or whether it was simply accepting that this particular hunt had failed remained unclear. But it withdrew, and we found ourselves once more watching it disappear into the wilderness. The rescue team reached us approximately 1 hour later. They provided emergency supplies of food and water, and they helped us navigate the final sections of terrain that led back to base camp. The journey that had required days to traverse in one direction took significantly less time to traverse in the opposite direction, with the assistance of the rescue team and with the improvement in our mental state, now that we were no longer being actively hunted. We reached base camp as darkness was falling on what we had calculated to be the 8th day of the expedition. The remaining members of our group who had departed earlier, including Devon, Sophie, and Henry, were already there. Having reached base camp without significant incident approximately 48 hours prior to our arrival, the reunion was emotional in ways that I did not anticipate. Even though we had all survived the expedition, the experience had marked us in fundamental ways. We gathered in the central tent, and Lucas provided a debriefing for the rescue team and for the other members of our group who had not been present for the encounters with the creature. His presentation was measured and careful in its language. He explained that we had encountered a large predatory animal, possibly a species that was either undocumented or extremely rare within the region. This animal had demonstrated intelligence and hunting behavior that was consistent with apex predators found in other mountainous regions. We had survived through a combination of caution, defensive positioning, and the strategic use of natural shelter. He did not mention the creature's seemingly impossible qualities, its apparent immunity to crossing lines of ash, or its apparent intelligence that seemed to exceed that of any natural animal. He did not mention the journal we had found or the remains we had encountered. He presented the experience in terms that could be reconciled with conventional understanding, that could be reported to authorities without generating disbelief or dismissal. I think in that moment I understood Lucas's behavior throughout the expedition. He had known, in some fundamental way, what we would encounter. He had perhaps hoped to navigate through the region without direct confrontation, but he had been preparing us, shaping our group, establishing the conditions necessary for survival. His adjustments to our route, his decisions about which team members would depart, his knowledge of protective practices that he had initially denied, all of these elements now seemed part of a deliberate strategy to give us the greatest possible chance of survival. After the debriefing, I spent time with each of the major figures in our expedition. Mia expressed her conviction that the experience had fundamentally changed how she understood wilderness and risk. She indicated that she would likely not participate in additional expeditions that ventured into remote areas, that her confidence in the efficacy of preparation and planning had been deeply shaken. Henry, who had departed earlier with Sophie, expressed some regret that he had not remained with the group. He believed that the recordings he had made, limited as they were, represented documentation of something genuinely significant. He was considering returning to the mountain region during the summer months, when conditions would be safer, to conduct a more systematic study of the creature's vocalizations and behavior. Matthew was already beginning to compile a comprehensive research document about the historical accounts of the creature and the protective practices that indigenous peoples had preserved. He seemed energized by the experience despite its danger, viewing it as a unique opportunity to document something that had previously been relegated to folklore and dismissed by conventional academic study. Alexander had proposed an idea of conducting a follow-up expedition, specifically designed to test the theory that the creature operated according to rules and limitations that could be systematically explored and understood. He seemed to believe that through careful study and experimentation, the creature could be understood in scientific terms, even if it did not fit into conventional categories of known animals. Charlotte and Daniel had made a joint decision to work with medical professionals to document the psychological and physiological impacts of the expedition. They wanted to contribute scientific understanding of how the human body and mind responded to extreme stress and to genuine predatory threat. Their willingness to transform trauma into useful data suggested that they had found meaning in the experience beyond simple survival. Evelyn expressed a kind of peaceful acceptance. She felt that the experience had brought the team members closer together and that they had all grown through the adversity. She seemed less interested in understanding the creature or in conducting follow-up studies, and more interested in ensuring that the team remained connected and supportive of one another moving forward. In the weeks following our return, I found myself struggling with how to process and contextualize what had occurred. The experience did not fit neatly into my previous understanding of the world. There were aspects of the creature's behavior that could be explained through conventional animal biology. There were other aspects, its apparent inability to cross certain barriers, its intelligence, its existence at all, given that no scientific documentation acknowledged it, that seemed to require acceptance of ideas that conventional science rejected. I have spent considerable time since the expedition researching the history of the Appalachian Mountains, the accounts of indigenous peoples who inhabited these regions, and the historical documentation of explorers who had entered the mountains and disappeared without trace. It becomes increasingly apparent that something genuine exists in those ancient hills, something that has maintained a consistent presence across centuries, and that has generated consistent patterns of folklore and protective practice across numerous cultures and time periods. Whether this entity is a species of animal that science has not yet documented, whether it represents something that transcends conventional biological categories, or whether it exists in a realm that sits between physical and spiritual reality, remains fundamentally unclear. What is clear is that the Appalachian Mountains maintain their mysteries, and some boundaries exist not because we are incapable of crossing them, but because things within those boundaries have learned to discourage our crossing. To those who might consider attempting similar expeditions, I would offer this caution. The wilderness is not simply a physical environment that can be conquered through preparation and determination. There are places on this earth that exist according to rules that we do not fully understand, places where ancient things persist, places where the boundary between our world and something else remains dangerously thin. The Appalachian Mountains, in their deepest regions, are such places. The creature we encountered still inhabits those mountains. The rules that govern its existence and behavior have not changed. If you venture into those territories, do so with full knowledge that you are entering a region that has not been rendered safe through human habitation or human comprehension. The mountains remember what we forget, and they have learned to protect their secrets through whatever means necessary. I have declined all invitations to return to the region. I have instead chosen to document these experiences and to preserve the knowledge that we gathered. Perhaps someday, when more is understood about the boundaries between our world and the worlds beyond, this documentation will prove useful. For now, I remain content to have survived, grateful for the team that accompanied me, and deeply respectful of the power that continues to inhabit the ancient mountains of Appalachia. The sun is setting as I complete these final words. In my peripheral vision, I occasionally see movement that seems to match the characteristics of the creature we encountered, but these sightings never resolve into clear vision. When I focus directly on them, the movement ceases, and I am left uncertain whether I actually observed something, or whether the experience of the mountains has left me with a heightened sensitivity to shadow and motion. Perhaps that is the true curse of encountering such things, not the immediate danger of confrontation, but the lasting awareness that the boundary between the known and the unknown is thinner than we prefer to believe, and that things move in the shadows of our comprehension, waiting for the moment when human attention is directed elsewhere. May you never encounter what we encountered in those mountains, and if you do, may the protective practices of those who came before prove as effective for you as they proved for us. I have been studying the journals and recordings left behind by 10 young people who ventured into the woodlands surrounding Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the autumn of 2019. What I am about to share with you is their account, reconstructed from their own words, their video logs, and the notes they frantically scribbled during those 4 days they spent in the mountains. The official investigation concluded that they became lost and suffered from exposure. That explanation is incomplete. I have decided to release their testimony in full, so that you can understand what truly happened in those dark forests where something older than memory still walks on 2 legs and wears the face of your friend. My name is James Carter, and I was 15 years old when this story began. I have to tell you about how we came to be in that place, because it matters. Nothing happens in isolation. There are always signs before something terrible arrives, little moments that seem innocent until they become markers of a line you should never have crossed. It started in September of that year. Emma Wilson, who was 16 and lived 2 streets over from me, had become obsessed with cryptid folklore. Her bedroom walls were covered with printed articles about Mothman sightings, grainy photographs of alleged Bigfoot tracks, and maps of reported Skinwalker territories. Most of us thought it was a phase. Most of us were wrong. Emma convinced her older cousin Liam Harris to organize what she called a camping expedition. Liam was 17, already working part-time at an automotive shop, and he had access to a truck and the kind of confidence that comes from being the oldest of a group. He did not take the folklore seriously. He thought it would be fun. He thought Emma was interesting and strange, and he wanted to impress her. Liam brought his friend Olivia Clark into the planning. Olivia was 18, a senior in high school with the kind of quiet intelligence that made people listen when she spoke. She agreed to the camping trip because she was good at planning logistics, and someone needed to be responsible. The 5 of them became the core of the group. There was also Noah Lewis, 19, who worked at the local grocery store and had a truck of his own. He wanted to go because the others were going, though he never admitted this directly. Then Emma added more people. Ava Walker was 20, technically an adult, though she had not quite left behind the feeling of being a teenager still making decisions based on what other people thought. William Hall was 21 and attended the community college an hour away. He had returned home for the weekend and agreed to join without fully understanding what he had agreed to. Sophia Allen was 22, already working in the administrative office of the county courthouse, a person with real responsibilities who probably should have known better than to take 4 days off for a camping trip she did not believe in. Benjamin Young was 23 and had recently moved back to the area after a failed attempt at living in Pennsylvania. He was looking for a reason to feel part of something again. Isabella King, the oldest of us at 24, worked as a nurse at the regional hospital. She had seen enough of human fragility that she did not fear what she could not explain. She thought a few days in the wilderness would be refreshing. She thought wrong. Liam spent the last 2 weeks of September researching locations. Emma had been very specific about where she wanted to go. She wanted Point Pleasant. She had read about the Mothman sightings that had occurred there in 1966 and 1967, the humanoid creature with enormous wings and hypnotic red eyes that appeared in the area just before the Silver Bridge collapsed. Emma believed that something was still there. She believed that the Mothman was just one of many things that inhabited those mountains, entities that the indigenous people had known about for thousands of years, entities that the white settlers had learned about only through the terror of encounter. Emma had found something else during her research, a reference to skinwalkers, not the Navajo creatures of the American Southwest, but something else, something that had been reported in the Ohio River Valley, a figure that appeared human until it was too late to run, a thing that wore the faces of people you knew, that could mimic their voices, that hunted at dusk and dawn in the spaces between the civilized world and the wild. I remember when she first told me about it. We were sitting in the parking lot after school on a Thursday in late September. The October air was already turning cold at night, and leaves were beginning to yellow on the trees that bordered the athletic fields. Emma opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me. She had been writing something, not sharing sources or articles, but her own thoughts, her own interpretation of reports she had collected. Skinwalkers are not just Southwest, she said. That is a popular misconception. The phenomenon is older than tribal boundaries. The Appalachian people knew about them. The early settlers wrote about them in journals. There was one sighting in 1887 near Charleston, West Virginia. A man reported that his brother came home from a hunting trip 3 hours late. The man who came home looked like his brother, moved like his brother, even knew things only his brother would know. But something was wrong with the way he moved his head. Something was wrong with how he smiled. The man shot his brother. He shot him, and the thing that was wearing his brother fell down, and when it hit the ground it sounded wrong. It did not sound like meat and bone. It sounded like something hollow. I asked her if she believed this was real. Emma looked at me for a long moment before answering. I believe, she said, that we do not understand what lives in the dark, and I believe that our lack of understanding does not make these things any less real. Liam had chosen a location carefully. It was not directly in Point Pleasant, but in the vast wilderness area about 20 miles northeast, in the hills and forests that surrounded the town. It was accessible by a logging road that had not been maintained in several years. There was a clearing, maybe 2 miles from the road, that could accommodate our camp. It was isolated enough to feel authentic to the experience we were seeking. It was far enough from help that if something went wrong, we would be alone with it. We departed on a Friday morning in late October. The weather was shifting. There had been frost on the car windows when I woke up. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was high and the afternoon was warmer, but the air held the promise of cold once night fell. Liam's truck could fit 6 people, though it was crowded. Noah drove separately in his own vehicle. Emma had insisted on keeping everyone together as much as possible, though she had not explained her reasoning. William, Sophia, Benjamin, and Isabella followed in William's sedan. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had reached the clearing. It took us 90 minutes to walk from the vehicles, following a path that grew less distinct as we moved deeper into the forest. The path had been used recently but not heavily. Animal tracks crossed it frequently. There was the scat of deer, the scat of something larger that none of us could identify. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 40 meters across. A creek ran along the eastern edge, the water cold and clear and moving rapidly over smooth stones. There were the remains of old fires here, blackened stones arranged in circles, charred wood that had been burning for no more than a year or two. "Good," Liam said, setting down his backpack. "We are not the first ones who have found this place. That is not necessarily a good thing," Olivia observed. She was already unpacking the camping equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, perhaps with her parents or with the Girl Scouts when she was younger. We set up camp methodically. 2 large tents, sleeping bags arranged inside, a central fire pit. Emma had brought specialized camping equipment, the kind that was expensive and suggested she had been planning this for months, possibly longer. She had brought a satellite messaging device, a backup power system, and what appeared to be equipment for recording audio and video in low-light conditions. "Why do you have all this?" I asked her, watching as she organized a battery pack and a professional-quality microphone. "Because," she said, "if something happens, I want it documented. I want evidence. People dismiss stories that come from nothing but words. But if you have recording, if you have data, that becomes harder to dismiss." By 5 o'clock, our camp was established, and dinner was being prepared. Sophia had insisted on cooking, and she had brought ingredients for a hearty stew that would take 2 hours to prepare over the campfire. As we waited, the light began to change. The sun, which had been warm and forgiving in the afternoon, turned orange and then red as it descended toward the horizon. The temperature dropped noticeably. People began putting on jackets and sweaters. Benjamin produced a bottle of whiskey that he had brought without telling Liam. They shared it around the circle, and the whiskey seemed to ease some of the nervousness that was becoming apparent in the group. People laughed louder. Conversations became more animated. The wilderness, which had seemed slightly intimidating in the afternoon, felt less threatening now that we were warm and together, with the promise of food soon to come. I sat between Noah and Isabella, watching the fire build. The flames were orange and gold, and they cast dancing shadows across the faces of the people I had known for most of my life. Yet in the firelight, these familiar people seemed somehow transformed. The shadows deepened the lines of their faces. The uncertainty of the light made their expressions harder to read. Sophia announced that dinner was ready, and we ate from bowls balanced on our laps, the stew hot and complex and comforting. The conversation turned to why we were here, what we were hoping to find. "We probably will not find anything," William said. He was the practical one among us, the one who worked with his hands and did not believe in things he could not hold or fix. "But if we do find something, we should just leave it alone. Disturbing wildlife is not a good idea." "We are not looking for wildlife," Emma said quietly. "We are looking for something that might be looking for us." The fire crackled. Someone made a nervous joke. The light began to fade from the sky more rapidly, and the trees that surrounded our clearing became indistinct silhouettes against the darkening blue above them. Olivia checked her phone. There was no signal, which was expected, but she had taken a screenshot of a map before we lost connection, and she had been marking our location mentally. "We are here," she said, pointing to an area on the map that seemed impossibly small and fragile, surrounded by so much wilderness. "Nearest help is about 5 miles south. If something happens, we signal for help, and we move toward that road." "Nothing is going to happen," Noah said, but he said it without conviction. The night deepened. The stars came out. First a few scattered points of light, then more, then an incredible display of stars that you cannot see in the town because of the light pollution. The Milky Way stretched across the sky above us, and under that immensity of light and darkness, our fire seemed very small, and our tent seemed very fragile. Gradually, people began to drift toward sleep. Ava and Emma shared one tent, Olivia and Sophia shared the other. The rest of us arranged ourselves around the fire, some attempting to sleep in camping chairs, others lying on sleeping bags in the open air around the perimeter of the camp. I did sleep, fitfully, moving in and out of consciousness as the fire burned down and the night grew colder. At some point, someone must have added wood to the flames, because the fire was still burning when I woke, though less brightly than before. It was the sound that woke me. a sound that did not belong in the darkness, a sound that was not the wind or the creek or the normal sounds of the wilderness. It was the sound of something walking on two legs, moving deliberately through the undergrowth beyond the circle of firelight. The walking sound continued for maybe 30 seconds. It was not hurried. It did not seem to be moving away from us. It moved with a kind of deliberate pace, as though whatever was making the sound was evaluating us, deciding something about us, the way a predator might circle prey. I sat up slowly. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness now. The others were waking too. I could see Liam stirring in his sleeping bag, Sophia's silhouette in the tent opening. Then the sound stopped. For the next few minutes, there was nothing but silence, and the sound of the creek, and the whisper of wind in the upper branches of the trees. We waited, and the waiting was somehow worse than the sound had been, because waiting means anticipation, and anticipation means fear. "Probably a deer," William said, but he too was sitting up now, alert. "Maybe an elk. They can sound almost like people moving sometimes." "Elk does not have the gait pattern of a biped," Emma said. She had been sleeping lightly, or perhaps she had not been sleeping at all. She was already standing, moving to the fire pit and adding more wood. The flames rose higher, extending the circle of visible ground around our camp, pushing the darkness further back. "We do not have elk in this part of West Virginia," Olivia added. "Exactly," Liam said. There was an edge to his voice that I had not heard before. "So it was a deer or a bear. We are in a wilderness area. We are supposed to be unsettled sometimes. That is part of the experience." But no one seemed fully convinced. We remained awake, sitting around the fire, listening to the night. The hours passed. People tried to resume sleeping but did not. The fire consumed the wood we kept adding to it. The next sound, when it came, was different. It was a call, or perhaps something between a call and a laugh. It came from the darkness beyond, the eastern edge of the clearing, the direction where the creek flowed. It was unlike any bird call I had ever heard, and unlike any animal sound. It had an almost human quality, but not quite human. It had a falseness to it, as though something was trying to imitate the sound of a human call, and getting almost all of the details right. But not quite. Benjamin stood up abruptly. He was holding one of the camping flashlights. "I am going to look," he said. "No," Olivia said flatly. "We stay together. We stay in the camp. We do not investigate sounds in the darkness in the wilderness." "It is probably an owl," William said, but his voice was weaker now. He did not believe what he was saying. The sound came again, from a different location. It was moving. Whatever was making it had shifted position, was now to the south of our camp, still beyond the visible perimeter but noticeably closer than before. Ava emerged from the tent, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. "What was that?" she asked, but we had no answer to give her. Emma remained by the fire, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I want everyone to listen to me," Olivia said. She was using the kind of voice that people used when they needed to be obeyed. "We are going to get everyone into the tents. We are going to close the tent flaps. We are going to stay inside for the rest of the night. No one leaves the tent for any reason except if there is an immediate emergency. No one investigates sounds. No one goes to the creek. No one does anything except wait for daylight." There was a quality to her command that made us comply. Perhaps it was because she was older. Perhaps it was because she sounded certain in a way that the rest of us were not. Perhaps it was because the thought of having some kind of barrier between us and the darkness was suddenly very appealing. We gathered our sleeping bags and belongings and moved into the tents. Liam and I shared the sleeping area where Noah was already attempting to rest. William and Benjamin squeezed into the space with us. We arranged ourselves like puzzle pieces, bodies close together for warmth and for comfort. Outside, the fire continued to burn. Olivia and Sophia had agreed to maintain it in shifts, staying awake and keeping the flames high. The light from the fire was visible through the semi-transparent fabric of the tent walls. Shadows moved across these walls occasionally, but whether they were from our own people moving around the fire or from something outside, I could not determine. I did not sleep. None of us did. We lay in the darkness of the tent, listening to the night sounds, listening to the sounds of the fire, listening for whatever had been walking around us in the darkness. It came again, the sound of bipedal movement, but this time it was different. It was faster. It was moving in a deliberate pattern around the entire camp, as though something was walking a perimeter, examining our camp from all sides. It would move along one edge of the clearing, then shift to another edge, moving with an unsettling pace that was too fast to be human, but with footfalls that were distinctly bipedal. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes or so. Eventually, they ceased. Whatever had been moving around us had stopped, had perhaps moved away, or had simply decided to stop circling and wait. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, nobody in that tent had slept. We lay in silence, listening to the sounds of birds beginning their morning calls, feeling the temperature start to rise as the sun approached the horizon. When Olivia's voice called out that it was dawn and it was safe to emerge, we did so immediately, stumbling out of the tent like people rising from tombs. The camp looked normal in the daylight. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Sophia was sitting on a camping chair, her eyes hollow, a coffee cup in her hands. Olivia was beside her, similarly exhausted. "Did you see anything?" Liam asked. "No," Olivia said, "but I heard it. It walked around us at least 3 times. It stayed at the edge of the firelight but did not come closer." "What was it?" Isabella asked. "I do not know," Olivia said. "I do not know what to call it or how to explain it, but I know what I heard." We prepared breakfast in an almost silent manner. People went through the motions of cooking and eating without much conversation. The energy of the previous evening, the sense of adventure and excitement, had been replaced by something else. Something cautious. Something afraid. Emma did not eat much. She was on her satellite device, typing something. I asked her what she was doing. "Logging the incident," she said. "Making notes. If we are experiencing something real, we need to document it properly. Date, time, environmental conditions, the sounds we heard and their approximate duration, everything." "You really believe something is out here?" I asked. Emma looked up from the device. "I believe that something made the sounds," she said carefully. "I believe that bipedal creatures walked around our camp in the darkness. I believe that something called out to us that was not a normal animal. Whether that means it is a supernatural entity or simply an animal we cannot identify, I do not know, but I know it was real." By 10 o'clock in the morning, a discussion had begun about whether we should leave. William was in favor of leaving immediately. Benjamin seemed torn. Noah was quiet, as he often was, and offered no opinion. Isabella surprisingly thought we should stay. "We came here to test our assumptions," she said. "Leaving now means we are running away without any useful data. If we are in danger, we should have experienced it last night. We are still alive. Let us stay and try to understand what we encountered." Liam looked at me. I was 17, but I was not a leader like Liam was. I was willing to do whatever the others decided. I was, if I am being honest, also terrified of the darkness that had felt so heavy and present during the night, and I did not want to experience it again. But I did not want to be thought of as a coward either. "I think we should stay," I said, surprising myself. "But maybe we should change our approach. Maybe we should be more careful. Maybe we should establish some rules about what we do and do not do." This pragmatism seemed to settle the group. We would stay, but we would be more methodical. We would establish a watch rotation, with people staying awake in the tent at all times. We would keep the fire burning continuously. We would not wander far from camp. We would stay together in groups of at least 3. Emma proposed something else. "Tonight," she said, "I want to try to document whatever comes. I want to set up the recording equipment. I want to try to capture audio evidence. If we are being visited by something that we cannot explain, we need that evidence." "That might be dangerous," Sophia said. "It might attract attention. It might provoke whatever is out there. It might also prove what we are experiencing," Emma countered. "That has value." We spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area around our camp, staying within sight of each other, trying to establish a sense of normalcy. We found a small waterfall about a quarter-mile from camp. We sat on the rocks near it and ate lunch. We talked about normal things, people back home, classes and work, things that seemed to matter in the civilized world but felt increasingly unreal here in this wilderness. As afternoon progressed, we returned to camp and made preparations for the night. Emma set up her recording equipment, placing the microphone on a small stand near the fire pit, running a cable back to a recording device she had placed in a weatherproof case. She tested the equipment, making sure it was capturing sound clearly. "If something happens tonight," she said, "we will have proof, we will have documentation, but what we were about to experience would not require documentation to be proven. The experience itself would be enough to change all of us, to mark us in ways we did not yet understand. The second night began like the first, with dinner and conversation and the gradual settling of darkness. But there was a different quality to it. We were hyper-aware now of every sound, every movement in the darkness beyond the fire. Some of us jumped at the sounds of normal wildlife. A fox called somewhere to the north, and we all froze. Wind moved through the trees, and we listened intently, trying to determine if it was just wind. Ava sat beside me as the evening deepened. She was shaking slightly, though the night was not particularly cold. "I do not want to be here," she said quietly. "I wanted adventure, but not this kind, not fear." "It might be nothing," I told her, though I did not believe it. "It might be just an animal we do not know. It might be something that will not harm us. Or it might be something that has been waiting in the darkness for a very long time," she said, "waiting for something like us to come stumbling into its territory." The night deepened. The stars emerged. Liam and William maintained the fire, feeding it wood methodically. Sophia and Olivia sat on camping chairs near the center of camp, maintaining the watch. The rest of us arranged ourselves around the perimeter, sleeping fitfully or not sleeping at all. It was around midnight when the calling started. It was Emma's name. Someone was calling her name from the darkness. It was a male voice, familiar sounding. It was calling, "Emma, Emma, where are you?" Emma sat up sharply, her hand going to my arm. I could feel her trembling. "That is my father," she whispered. "That sounds exactly like my father." "Your father is not here," Liam said. He was awake too, alert. "It is whatever has been out there." "I know," Emma said, but she was still staring into the darkness, toward the direction the voice had come from. The voice called again. "Emma, it is Dad. I came to get you. You should not be out here. It is not safe." It was perfect. The accent was right. The tone was right. The cadence of speech was exactly what her father sounded like. I knew Emma's father slightly, had heard him speak perhaps a dozen times. This was him. But it was not him. "Do not answer," Olivia said sharply. "Do not engage with it." "Emma," the voice called, and now it was coming from a different direction. It was coming from the south now, then from the east. It was moving around the camp, and it kept calling her name, kept trying to persuade her that help was coming, that she needed to go meet her father, that she was in danger and he was coming to save her. Emma was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her hands clenched into fists. She did not call out. She did not respond. But the effort of not responding seemed to take everything she had. Then the voice changed. It started calling out different names. It became Liam's mother, calling his name. Then William's father. Then it became Isabella, calling her own name, speaking in her own voice, asking herself to come out, to come to the edge of camp, to walk into the darkness. The voices were perfect. They were accurate beyond what any animal could possibly achieve. They knew our names. They knew our families. They knew details about us that they could not have known. "The recording," Emma gasped. "We are recording this. It will have the recording." "Emma, be quiet," Benjamin said. He was staring into the darkness beyond the fire, his jaw clenched. The voices continued, cycling through all of us, becoming our family members, calling us out into the darkness one by one. The ones who heard themselves called seemed to struggle with the impulse to answer. It was as though the voices had a power over us that transcended logic, a power that appealed to something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. But none of us answered. None of us left the camp. This continued for maybe an hour. Then, abruptly, the voices stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear something else. We could hear heavy breathing coming from the edge of the clearing. We could hear the sound of something large moving in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We could hear what sounded like claws or nails scraping against bark. And then we saw it. It stepped into the firelight, and everything that fear had prepared us for in our imaginings was insufficient for what we were actually seeing. It had the basic shape of a human body. It stood upright on two legs. It had arms and a head and a torso, but the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long. The arms extended too far down the sides of its body. The head was large and misshapen, and where its face should have been, there was something that looked like it was trying to be a face but could not quite get the details correct. Its skin, if it could be called skin, appeared to be mottled gray and brown, covered in what might have been hair, or might have been some kind of chitinous covering. Its eyes were too large, and they were an amber color that glowed in the firelight with a luminescence that eyes should not have. Its mouth was open slightly, And inside that mouth were too many teeth, and the teeth were wrong. They were not arranged like human teeth. They appeared to be multiple rows of pointed things. It was wearing tatters of clothing that might have once been human garments, but which had been reduced to almost nothing by whatever process had created this thing. My God! Sophia breathed. The thing's head turned toward her, its eye fixed on her with an intensity that seemed almost physical, as though the gaze itself was a touch. It made a sound. It was not a sound that any creature should be able to make. It was a clicking and a grinding, a sound that came from multiple places in its body at once. Then it moved. It did not run. It moved with a kind of loping gait that seemed to cover ground in a way that physics should not have permitted. It was moving toward the tents, toward the part of our camp where Ava and Emma had been sleeping, toward the part of the camp where 3 of our group were concentrated. Liam grabbed one of the camping flashlights, one of the large ones that put out significant illumination. "Get to the other side of the fire," he shouted. "Move, move now." We scattered. The thing's attention was divided for a moment, split between the people who were moving and the people it had been approaching. That moment of division was enough. Liam directed the beam of the flashlight directly into the thing's face, flooding its eyes with light. It shrieked. The sound was horrible. It was not like the calling of before, not like the voices of our families. This was a sound of rage and pain and hunger, a sound that seemed to communicate the depth of the thing's anger at being exposed to the light. It moved backward, away from the fire, away from the flashlight, its large form moving with surprising speed back into the darkness. For a moment, we could see its shape against the darkness, its outline against the lesser darkness beyond the clearing. Then, it was gone. We stood frozen, waiting, breathing heavily, unable to process what we had just witnessed. "Is everyone here?" Olivia demanded. She was doing a quick count, making sure all 10 of us were accounted for. "Is anyone hurt?" We were all here. No one was injured physically. But something in all of us had been injured in a way that running water and bandages could not address. "We are leaving," William said flatly. "In the morning we are packing up, we are leaving, and we are not coming back." No one argued. For once there was complete agreement among the group. The rest of the night was spent sitting closely around the fire, barely moving, barely speaking. We kept the flames high, kept the light bright, and we waited for the dawn. The thing did not return. But we could hear sounds from the darkness, sounds of movement, sounds of calling, different voices this time, calling different names, trying different approaches. When the sky finally began to lighten, we rose as one unit. We began packing frantically, throwing things into backpacks without much care for organization or method. We wanted to leave. We wanted to get back to civilization. We wanted to be away from this place. But before we could finish, before we could actually depart, something happened that would change everything. We had gotten perhaps a quarter of the way through our packing process when Liam collapsed. One moment he was standing there, rolling up his sleeping bag, and the next moment his legs simply gave way and he fell to the ground. "Liam!" Emma rushed to him, kneeling beside his body. "Liam, what is wrong?" He was conscious but unresponsive. His eyes were open but not tracking anything. His mouth was moving slightly, as though he was trying to speak but could not make his mouth work correctly. Isabella knelt beside him immediately, falling into a professional assessment mode despite the lack of equipment she normally would have had access to. "Liam, can you hear me? Can you move your fingers?" She checked his pupils, his pulse, his breathing. His heart is racing. His pupils are dilated significantly. "What is wrong with him?" Olivia asked. There was genuine fear in her voice, the kind of fear that comes from something that should not be happening, that violates the normal rules of how the world works. "I do not know," Isabella said. "There is no trauma, no visible injury, but his body is responding as though he is under extreme stress." Over the next few minutes, Liam began to speak, though his words were barely intelligible. He was talking about the thing, about what it had looked like. He kept repeating fragments of words, sounds that suggested he was trying to describe something that his mind was struggling to process. Then he began speaking differently. He began describing things in a way that seemed almost clinical, as though he was reading from a report. He described the creature in detail, detailed anatomical details that none of us could have described because we had not been able to look at it long enough. He described its internal structure, the way its organs were arranged, the composition of its outer integument. "Stop," Isabella said. She looked genuinely disturbed. "Liam, stop talking. You are frightening everyone." "I can see into it," Liam said, his words becoming clearer now, becoming more articulate. I can see its structure. I can see how it works. I can see the way it thinks. His eyes had changed. I noticed it and wondered if I was imagining it, but as I looked more carefully, I was certain I was not. His pupils seemed larger than they should have been. The amber color that his eyes had always been seemed to be shifting, becoming more golden, becoming more luminescent. He needs to get away from here, Benjamin said. He needs to get to medical facility. He needs serious help. We managed to get Liam up, though he was barely able to walk, his legs not responding correctly to his intentions. We helped him toward the path that led back to the vehicles. The journey that had taken 90 minutes with a normal pace took 3 hours because Liam kept stopping, kept seeming to need to rest, though his body was not actually tired so much as it seemed to be fundamentally altered in some way that none of us could understand. As we walked, we noticed something else. Liam's skin was beginning to change. In places, it seemed to be hardening, to be taking on that mottled gray and brown coloration that the thing we had seen had possessed. It started at his fingertips and was working its way up his hands. No, Liam said when he realized this. No, this is not happening. This is not real. We need to get him to a hospital, Isabella said firmly. This is beyond anything that camping first aid can address. We pressed on. The path became clearer as we descended, moving back toward the vehicles. Liam was becoming increasingly incoherent, his speech becoming increasingly difficult to understand. He kept touching his skin, feeling where the changes were occurring, making sounds of distress that were unlike anything a human should be able to make. By the time we reached the vehicles, Liam could barely move. We had to support him almost entirely, carrying him between us. His skin was now significantly altered. The changes were spreading across his torso. His face was beginning to shift, subtle changes but disturbing ones, changes that made him look less and less like the Liam we had known. We got him into the back of William's sedan. Liam looked at all of us, and despite everything that was happening to him, he seemed to be conscious enough to understand his situation. It is in me, he said. It put something in me. Something is changing me. Something is making me into something else. We are driving to the nearest hospital, Liam's mother said. She was the one who should have said this, but she was not here. We were here, and we were responsible for him. The drive took 2 hours. William drove at speeds that were significantly above the legal limit, but no police officer appeared to stop him. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring to get Liam to help, to get him to someone who could address what was happening to him. We arrived at the hospital and explained what we could, though much of it sounded insane. We described a camping accident, a fall, a possible allergic reaction. We did not describe the thing we had seen. We did not describe the changes we were observing in Liam's body. The hospital staff were skeptical, but they took him seriously because his physical presentation demanded that they do so. They admitted him. They ran tests. They took samples and scans and examinations. The results, when we were finally able to speak with people in authority, were inconclusive. There was nothing in the tests that could account for the physical changes they were observing. There was nothing in Liam's blood work that suggested any known infection or poison. There was nothing in his genetics that should have produced this kind of rapid physical alteration. But the changes continued. Over the course of 3 days, Liam transformed. His skin took on that mottled appearance entirely. His frame began to shift, his proportions becoming increasingly non-human. His mind seemed to be fragmenting. He would sometimes speak clearly about what had happened, and sometimes he would speak in that clicking, grinding language that the thing had used. On the 4th day, Liam stopped transforming. The changes seemed to have reached a stable point. He was still recognizably Liam, but only barely. His features had shifted significantly. His frame was altered. The amber eyes were permanent now, and they glowed slightly even in bright light. When we were allowed to see him, he was in a private room with guards stationed outside. The hospital had contacted state authorities. The state authorities had contacted federal authorities. Liam had become something that existed in a gray area between human and not human, and nobody knew how to handle him. I remember everything, Liam told us. His voice was still recognizably his voice, though there was something underneath it now, something that spoke in harmonics that human vocal cords should not be able to produce. I can remember being myself, and I can remember the other thing. I can remember what it wanted. I can remember what it was trying to do. What was it trying to do? I asked. It was trying to replace me, Liam said. It was trying to become me completely. It was trying to understand what it meant to be human by absorbing a human, by integrating with a human, by becoming human through the process of absorbing humanity. It wanted to understand our fear. It wanted to understand our families. It wanted to understand what it meant to be one of us, to belong to a community, to have people who cared about you. But it could not do it, Liam continued, because we rejected it, because the rest of you did not let it take me completely, because your light, your attention, your refusal to be separated prevented the transformation from going all the way. I am trapped now in this in-between space. I am neither what I was nor what it intended for me to be. I am something new, something the world has never seen before. The state of West Virginia requested that we return for an official inquiry. We were questioned about our account of events, about what we had seen and heard, about the equipment Emma had been recording with. Emma's recordings were confiscated immediately. The audio evidence of the voices, the sounds the creature had made, the shriek when Liam shone the flashlight on it, all of that was taken by officials who did not explain what they would do with it. We were told that our story was concerning but not verifiable. Liam's physical state was attributed to an unknown progressive condition, something for the medical establishment to study but not something that could be explained in any public forum. We were instructed not to speak about what had happened, not to release any footage or images, not to discuss Liam's condition with anyone. We returned to our lives in our town, but we could not fully return. Something had changed in all of us. The way we moved through the world was different. We were more aware of shadows. We were more aware of sounds that did not belong. We were more aware that the world was larger and more complex and more dangerous than we had been taught to believe. 2 months after the incident, Liam's family moved away. They left the state, seeking better medical facilities in another region, seeking a place where Liam could be treated without the scrutiny of state authorities. Before he left, he requested that I be allowed to see him one final time. I went to their house on a cold December morning. Liam was in the basement, in a room that had been specifically prepared for him. The walls were reinforced, the windows were barred. Liam sat in the center of the room, and he looked at me with those amber eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness for what he had become and what he had lost. "I am writing something," he said. "I am writing the full account of what happened, what I experienced, what I still experience. I wanted you to have it. I wanted someone to know the truth." He gave me a journal, a thick leather-bound notebook filled with his handwriting, pages and pages of accounts and details and analysis. The handwriting started out completely normal and became increasingly difficult to read as the pages went on, the letters becoming more angular and strange, until by the end it was almost unreadable, the script transforming into something that was barely language at all. "There is a reason," Liam said, "that those stories exist. There is a reason that cultures all over the world have stories about creatures that wear the faces of humans, about things that live in the darkness, about entities that hunger for something they cannot name. Those stories exist because the encounters are real, because the threat is real, because there are things in the wild places of the world that are older than human civilization, and they are curious about us." "Will you be okay?" I asked. "I do not know," Liam said. "My body is stable, but my mind is fragmenting. I can feel the presence of the thing that changed me, even though the physical transformation has stopped. I can feel it in my thoughts sometimes, suggesting ideas that are not my own, showing me perspectives that are not human. I do not know if I am still Liam or if I am becoming something else slowly, day by day." I left his house and I drove away, and I did not speak to Liam again. His family moved and left no forwarding address. Liam became a person from my past, someone I had known, someone who had transformed, someone who had become something that existed in the liminal spaces between the world I knew and the wild darkness beyond. But the effect of the encounter continued. Over the months following our return, each of us who had been there experienced strange phenomena. Emma developed an ability to understand languages she had never studied. She could read books in Arabic and understand them without translation. She could listen to conversations in languages from around the world and somehow comprehend them, as though the encounter had opened some part of her mind that had been closed before. William found that he could sense things that were wrong in ways that he could not explain. He would walk into a room and feel an almost physical pressure indicating that something was not right, something was wounded or damaged in a way that went beyond the visible. He developed an uncanny ability to diagnose mechanical failures before they occurred. A car he was working on would suddenly feel wrong to him, and he would start pulling it apart, finding the flaw that was beginning to develop, preventing failures that might have injured him. Olivia developed photographic memory, not gradually, but completely. Within a week of returning home, she could recall every word she had ever read, with perfect clarity. Every conversation she had ever had was available to her in full detail. She could relive memories with such clarity that it was like living through them again. This gift became a curse, because she could not forget anything, even things she desperately wanted to forget. Isabella found that her ability to assess the physical condition of patients became almost supernatural. She could walk into a room and immediately know what was wrong with a person, even without running tests or asking questions. She could see beneath the skin somehow, could sense the way a body was failing in ways that modern medicine would take hours to discover. The rest of us experienced similar changes, though less dramatic. We found ourselves better than we had been in small ways. Faster, stronger, more aware. Ava found that she could sense other people's emotions with startling accuracy. Noah found that he could repair things with greater skill and precision than he had previously possessed. Sophia found that she could organize information in her mind in ways that allowed her to solve complex problems with ease. Benjamin found that his body no longer seemed to suffer from fatigue in the same way. William and I found that we could see in lower light conditions than should have been possible. We all understood, without ever discussing it, that the encounter had marked us. The creature had touched us all in some way, had altered us all to some degree. We had survived something that should have killed us or changed us completely, and we had been left different for the experience. Emma eventually published a book about the encounter, though she carefully removed identifying information about the location and ourselves. The book was marketed as fiction, as a story rather than a true account. Most people read it as fiction and enjoyed it as fiction. Some people recognized the truth in it. Some people became obsessed with finding the real location, with finding the creature we had encountered, with trying to replicate the experience. We encouraged people not to look for it. We tried to warn people through every possible means that there were places in the wilderness where human beings should not venture, that there were creatures that should be left alone, that the price of encounter was not worth the price of knowledge. Years have passed since that camping trip in Point Pleasant. I am an adult now. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I have tried to move forward, to accept what happened as something from my past that I cannot change. But the encounter has never truly left me. It is there in my bones. It is there in the way I move through the world. It is there in the way I respond to darkness and sounds that do not belong. I have tried many times to explain what I experienced that night and that day to people who were not there. I have tried to make them understand the reality of what we encountered, the objective nature of the threat that exists in the wild places. Most people do not believe me. They think it is a story, an exaggeration, a fabrication that I have created for some purpose I do not quite understand. I do not blame them. If I had not experienced it directly, if I did not carry the marks of that experience in my own transformed self, I would not believe it either. But I want to offer a warning to anyone who listens to this account. There are places in the world, particularly in the Appalachian region, particularly in the areas around Point Pleasant and the vast wilderness that surrounds it, where something ancient and something other makes its home. This entity, which the Skinwalker stories of various cultures are trying to describe, exists at the margins of human civilization. It exists in the places where the wild has not yet been fully tamed, where the darkness still holds dominion. This entity is curious. It is intelligent. It is capable of deception. It wants to understand humanity, but it does not understand humanity in a way that we would recognize. It wants to know what it is like to have family, to have community, to have continuity of identity across time. These are things that the entity seems to lack, and it hungers for them. The voices you might hear in the darkness, calling names you recognize, offering help and comfort and rescue, are not the help and comfort of people who love you. They are the mimicry of something that is trying to lure you from safety. They are the songs of a predator disguised in the melody of your own life. If you hear such voices, do not answer. Do not investigate. Do not try to respond or engage. Stay in the light. Stay with people who can verify that they are who they claim to be. Stay together, and do not allow yourselves to be separated into the darkness. The creature that we encountered that night was not unique. The folklore of the Skinwalker exists across multiple cultures because multiple peoples have encountered this phenomenon. It exists in the mountains of Appalachia. It exists in the wild places beyond the borders of civilization. It exists in the forests and the canyons and the remote places where human beings have not fully established dominion. And it is still there. It is still hunting. It is still trying to understand humanity by becoming human, by absorbing human consciousness, by transforming itself through the process of merger with our kind. Liam was only partially successful from the creature's perspective. He was not fully transformed. He remained partially himself, but he was changed nonetheless, and he suffered for it. He carries a burden that no human being should have to carry. I have seen him twice since that first encounter. Both times, he was further along in his transformation. The amber of his eyes had spread slightly into the whites. The mottling of his skin had become more pronounced. He was becoming something other, something hybrid, something that belonged fully to neither his human past nor to the creature that had tried to consume him. When I asked him if he regretted going on the camping trip, his response was honest. "I regret many things," he said. "I regret that I did not listen to my instincts when they were telling me to turn back. I regret that I did not take the warnings more seriously. I regret that I was so convinced of my own invulnerability that I did not understand the danger, but I do not regret the experience itself. I do not regret that I survived it, because I am still myself. I am still Liam, even though I am changing. I am still the person that people can point to and say, look, he went into the darkness and he came back. He went into the wilderness and he encountered something unknowable and he survived it. But survival, I have come to understand, is not the same thing as coming out unscathed. We all survived, but we all carry marks from the experience that we will never be able to fully remove. Emma still records. She still documents the paranormal. She has become something of an expert on Skinwalker phenomena, and she has compiled an extensive database of historical accounts and contemporary reports. She is trying to understand the entity, to classify it, to find some way to predict its behavior. Liam's transformation has continued. The last I heard, his family was exploring the possibility of him living more permanently in an isolated location, where he could be himself without the scrutiny of a human society that does not know how to accommodate someone like him. And I continue forward, carrying the knowledge of what exists beyond the boundaries of the known world, carrying the awareness that the darkness is deeper and stranger and more alive than most people are willing to believe. I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know the truth. I believe you deserve to understand that the folklore warnings that our ancestors handed down to us were based on experience. They were trying to tell us something important. They were trying to keep us safe. And as we have abandoned these stories, as we have dismissed them as superstition, we have lost the protection that these stories were meant to provide. Do not venture into the wilderness unprepared. Do not approach the dark places with an attitude of invulnerability or skepticism. Do not assume that the world operates according to the rules that you have been taught, because there are places where those rules do not apply. There are places where something other has dominion. There are places where humanity is not the dominant force. And if you find yourself in such a place, if you find yourself hearing voices in the darkness, if you find yourself facing something that should not exist, remember what I have told you. Remember that light is a defense. Remember that community is a defense. Remember that refusing to be separated is a defense. The Skinwalker will call to you. It will use the voices of your loved ones. It will try to convince you that rescue is coming, that help is near, that you should step into the darkness to find safety. Do not believe it. Stay in the light. Stay together. Stay human. Because once you allow the darkness to take you, once you allow the thing from beyond the boundaries of the known world to touch you and change you, you may survive, but you will never be the same. You will be transformed. And transformation, my friends, is a burden that no human being should have to carry. This is the truth of what happened to us. This is the warning that I am leaving for anyone who comes after. And this is the account of the night we walked into the darkness, and the darkness walked back with us. It's not extenuate. Before I tell you what happened to my group in the Appalachian coal country, I need you to understand something. Not all stories come from the internet or some creepypasta forum. Some of them are whispered in the dark by people who lived through them, people like me. What I experienced in those mountains changed everything I thought I knew about what exists beyond the reach of civilization. This is not a legend. This is not folklore passed down until it became unrecognizable. This is what happened when 10 of us decided to explore the abandoned coal mines near Blackwater Ridge in eastern West Virginia. We went looking for history. We found something else entirely. Something that should have remained hidden. The Appalachian Mountains in October are deceptive. On the surface, they appear almost peaceful, draped in shades of amber and rust. The autumn air is crisp, the kind of cold that feels clean when it fills your lungs. But underneath that beauty, the mountains hold secrets that predate civilization itself. We arrived at our base camp near Blackwater Ridge on a Friday afternoon. Our group consisted of 10 people, all of us connected through a shared interest in American history and outdoor exploration. I had organized the trip after months of research into the region. The coal mines in this area had been closed since the late 1970s, abandoned when the industry collapsed and the companies moved on to greener, more profitable ventures. What remained was a landscape dotted with entrances to vast underground networks, most of them cordoned off and forgotten. Ethan Phillips was our photographer. At 35 years old, he carried an expensive camera around his neck like it was part of his body. He moved through the world documenting everything, always looking for the perfect shot, the image that would tell the whole story in a single frame. Beside him was Abigail Campbell, who had become his partner both professionally and romantically over the course of the previous year. At 36, she possessed an almost reckless courage that made her invaluable on expeditions. She was the first to rappel into uncertain spaces, the first to volunteer for night watches. Michael Parker was our historian, a professor who had taken a sabbatical specifically to join this expedition. His knowledge of the mining operations and the communities that had depended on them was encyclopedic. Emily Evans, also in her late 30s, served as our medic and nutritionist, carefully planning every meal, monitoring everyone's physical condition. Jacob Edwards was a tech specialist, responsible for our satellite communication devices and the drone he had brought to map the cave systems from above. Elizabeth Collins was a geologist. She understood the composition of the rock, the stability of the passages, the likelihood of collapses. Logan Stewart was our guide, a local man who had grown up in the shadow of these mountains and claimed to know them better than anyone alive. Sophia Sanchez, Jackson Morris, and Ella Rogers rounded out our party. Each of us had a role. Each of us had a reason for being there. None of us truly understood what we were walking toward. We established camp at a distance of about 2 miles from the nearest mine entrance. Emily set up our tents in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The tree canopy was thick enough that we felt sheltered, almost protected. We built a fire ring and settled in as the sun descended behind the ridge. The temperature dropped quickly once darkness fell. In the mountains, the absence of human infrastructure means an absence of light pollution. The stars emerged with stunning clarity. Thousands of them spread across the black sky like spilled diamonds. That first night, we talked around the fire. Michael shared historical anecdotes about the miners who had once worked these tunnels, extracting coal for fuel and profit, while gradually poisoning their own lungs with the dust. Ethan photographed the firelight on our faces. Abigail drank coffee and looked out into the darkness with an expression of peaceful anticipation. It was Logan who first mentioned the stories. He waited until the fire had burned low, until the night was deepest around us. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. He told us that local people, the families who still lived in the small towns surrounding these mountains, had warnings about the mines. Not warnings about collapse or contamination or accidents, but warnings about something else. Something that lived in the deep places, in the vast caverns where no sunlight had ever reached. I asked him what he meant. Logan hesitated. He looked around the circle at each of us, seeming to measure our willingness to listen. Then he said that the Appalachian people had always known about creatures that did not match any known animal. Creatures that could take human form but were not human. Creatures that hunted in the darkness. Abigail laughed. She said that every region had its folklore, its monsters and warnings designed to keep people away from dangerous places. Why would it be any different here? Logan did not argue with her. He simply said that the old stories were old for a reason. They had survived because they contained truth, or at least a version of it that people needed to tell and retell until it became embedded in the culture. I found his words disturbing in a way I could not quite articulate. I had done extensive research on the mines and the region, but I had largely dismissed the supernatural elements as cultural artifacts, Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but not literally true. Sitting there in the darkness, with the mountains pressing down around us and the fire gradually dying into embers, I felt less certain of that assessment. We retired to our tents around midnight. I shared my tent with Michael, who fell asleep almost immediately, his soft snoring a strangely comforting presence. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustling in the undergrowth, every crack of a branch, seemed significant. At some point near dawn, I finally slept. The next morning, we prepared for our first exploration. We divided into 3 groups. Ethan and Abigail would take the drone and photograph the landscape. Michael, Elizabeth, and I would head to the mine entrance nearest to our camp and begin preliminary documentation. The other 5 would establish supply caches and prepare additional campsites deeper in the mountains. As we gathered our equipment, Emily approached me. She pulled me aside, away from the others. She told me that she had heard something during the night, something that did not sound like any animal she could identify. It had moved through the forest near the camp perimeter, and it had stopped several times, as if listening or observing us. She had not mentioned it to the others because she did not want to cause panic, but she thought I should know. I assured her that it was probably just a deer or another large mammal startled by our presence. But even as I said it, I remembered Logan's warnings from the previous evening. I filed Emily's report away in my mind, attaching significance to it that I would later regret. The entrance to the mine we selected was marked by a massive metal grate, presumably installed decades earlier to prevent trespassing. The grate was corroded with rust, and several sections had already begun to separate from their moorings. The opening was large enough for a person to squeeze through, though it would require some maneuvering. The darkness beyond was absolute. Elizabeth examined the rock face surrounding the entrance. She pointed out evidence of settling, small cracks that suggested the ground had shifted over time. She assured us that the entrance shaft appeared stable, at least for the immediate vicinity. Michael photographed everything, his face alight with the excitement of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. I led the way through the gap in the grate. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that descended gradually into the earth. The walls were rough-hewn, bearing the marks of the picks and explosives that had removed the coal. The air smelled of stone and something else, something organic that had been trapped underground for decades. We moved slowly, carefully checking the stability of the passage with each step. Michael was documenting everything, sketching the layout of the mine in a notebook. Elizabeth continued her geological assessment, occasionally stopping to examine the rock strata exposed in the walls. We had descended perhaps 100 meters when the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight revealed the remnants of mining equipment, small carts on twisted rails, tools long since abandoned. This was where the work had happened, where men had spent their days extracting the compressed energy of prehistoric forests. The chamber was enormous. Our flashlights could not reach the ceiling or the far wall. The acoustic properties of the space caused our footsteps to echo and multiply, making it sound as though there were far more of us than 3 people moving through the darkness. Michael was nearly vibrating with excitement. He said that this chamber was exactly as described in the historical records he had studied. He began to move deeper into the space, examining the equipment more closely. That was when I heard it. It was not loud. In fact, it was almost impossibly quiet, a sound that barely registered above the ambient noise of our breathing and footsteps. It was the sound of something heavy moving through the darkness at the far end of the chamber, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. I stopped moving. I raised my hand to signal Michael and Elizabeth to do the same. We stood in absolute stillness, our flashlights illuminating only the small circles of rock directly in front of us. The sound came again. It was closer now, but still indistinct. I could not determine what it was or how far away it might be. The echoes in the chamber distorted everything, made distances impossible to gauge. Elizabeth whispered that we should leave. She said that our presence had likely disturbed some animal, possibly a bat colony or something larger. Michael wanted to investigate further, to push deeper into the mine to explore more of the chambers. I made the decision to retreat. I did not like the way that sound had raised the hair on my arms, the primal instinct that screamed at me to get out of this place. We turned back toward the entrance. Our retreat was not quite a run, but we moved more quickly than was entirely safe in the darkness. We did not stop until we had exited the grate and were standing once again in natural light. Behind us, the darkness of the mine shaft seemed to deepen, as though the interior space had become less a place of geology and more a place of hunger. We did not speak about what we had heard until we returned to camp. The others were already there, gathered around a lunch that Emily had prepared. Ethan showed us the drone footage he had captured. The landscape was mapped in extraordinary detail, thousands of acres of forest and mountain terrain rendered in high resolution. In the center of the footage, there was an anomaly. It appeared to be an area of forest where the canopy had become disturbed, where large sections of trees seemed to have been recently flattened or torn apart. The damage did not follow any pattern that weather or animal activity would typically produce. It looked as though something massive had forced its way through the forest, moving with destructive power and complete disregard for the plant life in its path. Jacob studied the footage with me. He said that the damage looked relatively recent, possibly only days or weeks old. He asked if I had any explanation for what could cause such destruction. I told him that I did not. I did not mention what we had heard in the mine. I did not mention Emily's report from the previous night. I was operating on an assumption that if we did not acknowledge these things, they would not become real, would not force us to reconsider the narrative we had constructed around this expedition. That night, we took stronger precautions around the camp. Logan set up a perimeter of bells and hanging objects that would create noise if anything large passed through. Michael and Abigail volunteered for the first watch. The rest of us retired to our tents. I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the sound in the mine, the way it had raised every defensive instinct in my body. I kept thinking about the flattened trees in Ethan's footage. I kept thinking about Logan's warnings and Emily's observation, and the sense that we had somehow made a terrible mistake by coming to this place. Sometime after midnight, I heard the bells. They rang out in a frantic cacophony, one set of them following another as something large moved through our perimeter. There were sounds of movement in the camp, shouting, the beams of flashlights cutting through the darkness. I grabbed my own flashlight and exited my tent to find most of the group already awake and armed with whatever defensive implements they had brought. We stood in a tight cluster, looking out into the darkness surrounding our camp, searching for whatever had triggered the alarm. The bells had stopped. Whatever had passed through our perimeter had continued on its way, moving deeper into the forest and away from our camp. We found tracks in the morning, massive prints that did not match any known animal. Each one was 5-toed, with what appeared to be opposable digits. The stride was enormous, nearly 2 meters between each impression. Elizabeth examined them with growing concern. She said that the prints were inconsistent with any native predator or scavenger that she was aware of. She suggested that it might be a person, someone large and unusual, but even as she said it, I could see that she did not believe it. We made a decision to abandon camp and relocate deeper into the mountains, moving closer to the mines. The logic was that we would be safer in sheltered locations, that the caves and mine entrances could provide protection. In retrospect, this was the moment when our expedition shifted from exploration to something far more dangerous. We broke camp on the morning of our 4th day in the mountains. It took most of the day to pack our equipment and establish our new location near the entrance to Shaft 3, one of the largest mining operations in the region. The entrance was collapsed in several places, but a series of side passages allowed access to the deeper tunnels without navigating through the most unstable sections. The mood among our group had changed. The excitement and camaraderie that had characterized the first days had begun to erode. People spoke less during our meals. During the night watches, I could see the fear in people's eyes, a wariness that had not been present before. On our first night at the new camp, something tried to enter Jacob's tent. He was awake, alert and ready as he always was during his watch period. When he heard the sound of something heavy pressing against his tent wall, he immediately began shouting, which caused the rest of us to emerge armed and ready. By the time we had gathered, whatever had been at his tent had moved away into the darkness. Jacob described the incident in vivid detail. He said that something had pressed against his tent with enormous force, something that clearly possessed strength far beyond any human baseline. The fabric had stretched inward, nearly tearing. He said that he could hear it breathing, deep and controlled, a sound that came from a throat massive enough to produce volume without effort. Abigail wanted to pursue it, to follow the creature into the forest and attempt to confront it. I refused. I told her that pursuit would likely only result in injury or death, that we needed to focus on security and protection until we understood what we were dealing with. Michael was pale. He consulted his historical notes, flipping through pages with shaking hands. He told us that there were accounts in the old records, oral histories collected from miners and their families, of something that lived in the deep places, something that was not quite animal and not quite human. The miners had called it many things. The Appalachian people had given it a name, one that appeared in various folklore traditions. Skinwalker, he said the word carefully, as though simply speaking it might summon attention. They had called it a skinwalker, a creature from more ancient traditions, one that had no business existing in the eastern mountains but apparently did, or had, centuries ago, or still did. Logan confirmed that the old stories matched what Michael was describing. He added that the miners had believed these creatures were territorial, that they maintained specific areas of the mountains as their domain. The coal mines had been built without knowledge of the creature's presence, or perhaps despite that knowledge. The families had eventually abandoned the mines not just because the coal had become less profitable, but because so many miners had gone missing or returned from the deep shafts changed somehow, disturbed in ways that no physical injury could explain. I asked Logan why he had not been more specific about this when we were planning the expedition. He replied that he had assumed that modern skepticism and scientific knowledge would shield us from the danger. He said that he had not truly believed in the creature himself until he saw the tracks and heard the sounds and witnessed the behavior that no animal could exhibit. Elizabeth was less convinced by the folklore explanation. She argued that everything we had observed could be explained by an unidentified large mammal, possibly an escaped exotic animal, possibly something that had populated the region in recent years without being catalogued by wildlife management. She admitted that the scale of the creature seemed beyond anything plausible, but she maintained that the supernatural explanation was a last resort to be pursued only when all rational possibilities had been exhausted. I respected her commitment to reason, even though I was increasingly convinced that reason was no longer applicable to our situation. Over the next 2 days, we attempted to establish a routine that would allow us to continue our documentation work while minimizing our exposure to danger. We conducted our explorations of the accessible mine passages during daylight hours, always in groups of at least 3, always with emergency supplies and communication devices. At night, we maintained a carefully constructed camp with multiple alarm systems and carefully selected guard positions that would provide early warning of approach. During one of our daytime explorations, we discovered something that changed our understanding of the situation entirely. Deep in Shaft 2, we found evidence that the creature was using the mine passages, not as a hunting ground but as a shelter. We found areas where large sections of stone had been deliberately rearranged, moved by strength that could only be described as superhuman. We found what appeared to be a den, a chamber deliberately emptied of its equipment, the walls smoothed as though by repeated contact from something massive. Most disturbingly, we found remnants of human clothing scattered throughout various passages, remnants that appeared to date from different time periods. A miner's helmet from the 1950s, a jacket from the 1970s, modern hiking equipment that could not have been more than a few years old. The implications were clear. The creature had been using these mines for a very long time. It had been hunting, and it had been successful. It had claimed lives across multiple decades, and its depredations had gone largely unnoticed by the outside world because the miners and the families had been too afraid to speak openly about what they knew. Michael spent hours documenting everything, sketching the arrangements of clothing, photographing the modified chamber. His hands shook as he worked. He kept muttering that this changed everything, that the historical records would need to be completely recontextualized, that the disappearances attributed to mining accidents and collapses had likely been something far more sinister. On the evening of our 6th day in the mountains, Sophia went missing. She had been on the night watch with Jackson. At some point during the watch, she had reported that she was going to walk a perimeter check around the camp. She never returned. When Jackson realized that too much time had passed, he woke the rest of us. We organized a search immediately, combing the area surrounding our camp with flashlights and calling her name repeatedly. There was no response. We found traces of her passage, boot prints that led away from camp toward the forest. The tracks ended abruptly in an area of disturbed earth and vegetation, as though she had been lifted directly upward rather than pulled horizontally. Ella was devastated. Sophia had been her closest friend in the group, and Ella's grief quickly transformed into anger. She demanded that we organize a larger search, that we pursue deeper into the forest. I had to make the decision to refuse her. I told her that we could not risk more lives, that Sophia was almost certainly dead, that organizing a pursuit would likely only result in more casualties. Ella did not speak to me for the rest of that night. We held what we could only describe as a memorial service the following morning. There were no remains to bury, no body to confirm the worst. We simply stood together and acknowledged that Sofia Sanchez, who had been a vital part of our group, was gone. The loss transformed our mission. We were no longer exploring or documenting. We were surviving. Every decision became focused on protection and security. Michael wanted to push deeper into the mines to gather more evidence. I refused. Abigail wanted to track the creature, to identify where it had taken Sophia. I refused. Ethan wanted to capture footage. I refused every request that would take us farther from camp, every action that would increase our exposure to danger. On the following night, we heard sounds coming from deep within the mine shaft we had been using as emergency shelter. It was not the distant, uncertain sounds we had heard before. It was unmistakable. It was the sound of something massive moving through the passages, something that was approaching our camp with apparent deliberation. The sounds grew louder. They were joined by something else, something that might have been vocalization, a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a scream, but combined elements of both. The sound was not human. It could not be human. No human throat could produce such a thing. We gathered all our equipment and fled. We abandoned our camp with only what we could carry. We left the tents, the supplies, the documentation materials. We moved as a group through the forest, moving away from the mines and toward the one place we thought might offer help and shelter. There was a small town, maybe 3 kilometers from our position. It had been marked on our maps as Blackwater, named after the stream that ran through it. The town consisted of perhaps 50 buildings, most of them empty or minimally maintained, relics of an era when the coal industry had supported a viable community. The postmaster, a man named Robert, had been one of Logan's contacts before our expedition. Logan thought that Robert might be able to help us, might be able to provide information about what we were facing and perhaps contact authorities. We reached the town shortly after dawn. We were exhausted, traumatized, our nerves raw from hours of running through difficult terrain in the dark. Robert greeted us with a wariness that suggested he knew exactly what had happened, that he had been expecting us to arrive in exactly this condition. Robert lived in a small house at the center of Blackwater. It was one of the few buildings that appeared to be actively maintained, with fresh paint on the shutters and a garden that showed evidence of regular care. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with the weathered skin of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. When he saw us stumbling down the main street, exhausted and frightened, he immediately ushered us inside. He provided water and food without asking questions. Only after we had begun to recover slightly did he ask what had happened. Logan explained our situation. He told Robert about the sounds, the tracks, the evidence we had found in the mines, and finally about Sophia's disappearance. He told him about the creature, about the clothes and equipment we had found scattered throughout the passages. Robert listened without interrupting. When Logan had finished, Robert walked to a shelf and retrieved a large leather-bound book. It appeared to be a journal of some kind, filled with handwritten notes and sketches. Robert opened it to a section marked with a ribbon and began to read. The journal had belonged to his grandfather, Robert explained. His grandfather had been a miner, one of the last to work the deep shafts before the mines were closed in the 1970s. The journal documented not the technical aspects of mining, but the experiences and observations of a man who had gradually realized that the mines were not safe in any conventional sense. The entries began routinely enough, documenting daily work, the names of colleagues, the amounts of coal extracted. But gradually, the entries became more anxious. There were references to missing workers, to people who simply did not return from their shifts. There were descriptions of strange sounds heard in the deep passages, of movements in the darkness, of things that did not correspond to any animal known to science. Robert's grandfather had eventually become convinced that something inhabited the deep mines, something intelligent and predatory. More importantly, he had begun to record observations that suggested the creature was not a simple animal but something more complex. It appeared to have territorial awareness, to respond to human activity, to deliberately hunt in patterns that suggested strategy and planning. One particular entry caught my attention. Robert read it aloud. His grandfather had written that the creature seemed to be something that had been known to the Appalachian people for centuries, something that appeared in the oldest stories and oral traditions under various names. He had spoken with an older woman in town, someone who was knowledgeable in folk traditions, and she had told him that the creature was called a skinwalker in the language of the older peoples, that it was a being from another category of existence entirely. According to the woman's understanding, the creature could take human form. It could move through human society undetected because it could wear a human shape the way a person might wear a costume. But in its true form, it was something else entirely, something predatory and powerful. Worse, the woman had suggested that the creature was not entirely natural, that it did not fit into the standard categories of biology or ecology. It was something that existed in the margins of reality, in the places where human civilization had not quite fully established itself, in the darkness beneath the earth where the old rules still applied. Robert's grandfather had become terrified. He had tried to convince others in the community that the mines needed to be sealed, that no one should work in the deep passages. But he had no proof beyond anecdotal evidence and folktales. The mining company had dismissed his concerns. Management had viewed him as an unstable worker, someone whose fear had made him unreliable. Eventually, Robert's grandfather had left the mines. He had taken work elsewhere, but he had never truly recovered from what he had experienced. He had spent the rest of his life documenting his observations in the journal, trying to create a record of something that no one wanted to acknowledge. Robert closed the journal. He told us that his grandfather had died in 1983, having spent the last years of his life compiling everything he knew about the creature into the written record. Robert had inherited the journal, but he had largely viewed it as his grandfather's personal trauma, not as documentation of anything that was still relevant. That had been a mistake, Robert said. He had been reading reports of missing hikers and campers in the area for years. He had attributed them to the normal dangers of the mountains, to inexperience and poor planning. But the pattern of disappearances, he said, matched very closely with what his grandfather had documented. Michael asked if Robert had any information about what the creature actually was, beyond the folk classification of skinwalker. Was it an animal? Was it something that had a physical form that could be studied or understood? Robert said that his grandfather's research had suggested that the creature was indeed physical in some sense, but that it did not conform to normal biological principles. It was strong beyond anything that should be possible for a terrestrial mammal. It was intelligent, more intelligent than any animal. It seemed to have some ability to understand and respond to human behavior. Most disturbing, Robert said, was the suggestion in his grandfather's notes that the creature had some connection to human history and human communities. The old woman his grandfather had spoken with had indicated that skinwalkers in the original traditions were humans who had been transformed, either voluntarily or through curse, into something other than human. They could assume human form again, but they carried their predatory nature with them. They could live in proximity to human society, potentially even integrate into it, while remaining fundamentally dangerous. Emily asked whether there was any way to kill the creature, any known method or weapon that might be effective. Robert shook his head. His grandfather's notes contained no accounts of anyone successfully defending themselves against the creature through violence. The few instances where confrontation had been avoided, people had simply fled, had removed themselves from the creature's territory, and the danger had subsided. This was the revelation that truly terrified all of us. We had been thinking of our situation as a containment problem, something that could be solved through evasion and the hope of rescue. But if Robert's grandfather's information was accurate, the only true solution was retreat. Complete abandonment of the area and the acceptance that we had stumbled into something that was not meant for human intrusion. Abigail argued vehemently against this conclusion. She insisted that we could find a way to confront the creature, to gather the information necessary to develop some kind of weapon or strategy. She said that we had electronic equipment, communication capabilities, scientific knowledge. There had to be something we could do beyond simply running away. But even as she spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes. She understood at some level that we were not equipped for this kind of conflict. Jacob said that we needed to contact authorities, that we needed to make reports to the police and to wilderness management agencies about what we had experienced and observed. Perhaps an organized response, with proper equipment and personnel, could address the situation in ways that our small group could not. Robert warned us against that course of action. He said that authorities would not believe us. He said that the area was remote enough that reports of unusual activity were routinely filed and then dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. He said that his grandfather had tried to report his concerns to local law enforcement in the 1970s and had been treated as mentally unstable for his troubles. The situation seemed hopeless. We had come to explore history and had instead stumbled into something that current knowledge and understanding could not adequately explain. It was Michael who suggested that we continue our investigation from a safe distance. He said that Robert's journal and his grandfather's observations were valuable documentation, but they were limited by the technology and knowledge available in the 1970s. He said that with modern equipment and techniques, we might be able to gather definitive evidence of the creature's existence. That evidence could then be used to force authorities to acknowledge the problem and take action. I was skeptical, but Michael was persuasive. He argued that we had already lost Sophia. Retreating now would mean her death served no purpose beyond making us safer. But if we could gather evidence, if we could force the world to acknowledge that something extraordinary existed in these mountains, then perhaps some good could come from the tragedy we had experienced. Ethan agreed. He said that his photographic and video equipment could capture evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. He said that he had footage from the drone that already showed anomalies, evidence that something unusual was occurring in the forest. Abigail was immediately on board. She said that she wanted to continue, that she felt responsible for our group and wanted to ensure that we either escaped safely with evidence or did not allow the creature to hunt us indefinitely without consequences. The others were less enthusiastic, but after discussion, they agreed that attempting to gather evidence was worth the risk. It provided a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, which was psychologically important for all of us. Robert agreed to let us stay at his house and use it as a base of operations. He provided us with detailed maps of the mine locations and with his grandfather's journal, which contained observations about the creature's behavior patterns and territorial ranges. This information suggested that the creature favored the deeper mines and certain sections of the forest, areas that it had claimed as its primary hunting ground. We developed a plan that would allow us to gather evidence while minimizing our exposure to danger. Ethan and Abigail would return to specific camera locations we had established near the mine entrances and retrieve recorded footage. Michael, Elizabeth, and I would extract additional samples from the modified chambers deep in the mines, material that might provide physical evidence of the creature's presence. The others would maintain a secure base and handle communications. It was a desperate plan, one that put specific people into immediate danger, but it was a plan that gave us something to do beyond simply waiting for rescue or death. We spent the next day preparing. Robert provided us with supplies and equipment from his own resources. He had maintained a cache of camping gear, having done his own exploring of the mountains in his younger years. He also provided us with firearms, weapons that I was deeply reluctant to accept, but which Michael and Abigail insisted would be necessary. I had never been comfortable with weapons. Robert showed us how to handle the rifles safely, how to load and fire them. He was matter-of-fact about the instruction, neither encouraging nor discouraging our use of the weapons, simply ensuring that if we chose to carry them, we would not accidentally harm ourselves in the process. On the morning of the 8th day of our expedition, we set out to retrieve the camera footage that Ethan had been recording before our evacuation from the initial camp. The camera had been placed on a motion-activated tripod positioned to capture the mine entrance and the surrounding forest. If anything large had passed through the area since our departure, it would have been recorded. The journey back to the original camera location took us through familiar terrain and into the areas where we had heard the creature's vocalizations and seen its tracks. Our group moved carefully, alert for any sign of the creature's presence. Ethan reached the camera location and retrieved the device. As we were preparing to leave the area, we heard a sound in the distance, a roar that seemed to shake the very air around us. It was the first time we had heard the creature's vocalization in daylight, the first time its presence had been announced with such unmistakable directness. We did not wait to see how close it might be. We moved toward the forest edge, seeking tree cover and visibility that would allow us to move quickly. Behind us, the sound echoed again, now noticeably closer. The creature was pursuing us. This was the moment when fear transformed into action driven purely by survival instinct. We moved at speeds that were dangerous on the uneven terrain. Behind us, we could hear large branches breaking, could hear something massive forcing its way through the undergrowth with complete disregard for the obstacles in its path. The creature was faster than it should have been. It was closing the distance between us with inexorable certainty. Abigail turned and fired the rifle. The sound of the shot was startlingly loud in the forest. For a moment, everything went quiet. The pursuit seemed to pause. Then it resumed, and the creature made a sound that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was not an animal sound. It was almost a shriek, something that combined agony and fury and a kind of inhuman defiance. Abigail had hit it. We did not slow to see what damage the shot had caused. We continued moving toward the town, moving faster than caution would have advised, but moving faster than the creature would catch us. We reached the town and Robert's house near midday. We were exhausted, our hearts racing from the exertion and the fear. Abigail had blood on her arm, and it took a moment to realize that she had been struck by something, a branch or a projectile. She could not remember which. Emily treated the wound. It was not serious, a deep laceration but not life-threatening, but the injury was proof that the creature was real, that it was capable of physically attacking us, that running was not a sustainable long-term strategy. We examined the camera footage. What we found was extraordinary. The footage showed the mine entrance continuously from the moment we had departed our camp. For the first several hours there was nothing, just the static image of rock and forest. But then, near midnight on the night after we had evacuated, something appeared. It came from the darkness of the mine entrance, and it moved in a way that was clearly neither human nor animal. The video quality was not perfect, but it was clear enough to see something bipedal, something massive, something that bore a superficial resemblance to a human shape, but that was distinctly wrong in almost every aspect. The proportions were off. The movement was off. The way it turned and looked directly at the camera suggested intelligence and awareness. The creature paused at the mine entrance for nearly 3 minutes, the camera capturing every frame. Then it moved toward the camera, and the footage showed a close-up of something that defied easy categorization. It had features that might have been a face, but they were arranged in a way that was fundamentally alien. The eyes were too large. The mouth opened vertically instead of horizontally. The skin had a texture that might have been scales, or might have been something else entirely. The footage ended abruptly when the creature reached the camera, presumably destroying it in the process. Michael was pacing frantically. He said that the footage was proof, that it was definitive evidence that something extraordinary existed in the mountains, that the creature was real, and that it was not any known animal. He said that if we could publicize this footage, if we could force the academic and scientific communities to view it, they would have to acknowledge the existence of something that currently was not accounted for in any known taxonomy. Elizabeth was more cautious in her assessment. She noted that the footage could potentially be explained as a hoax or as a misidentification of a known animal. She acknowledged that the creature's features seemed wrong, but she suggested that compression artifacts or poor lighting conditions could have contributed to that impression. Ethan did not engage in the debate. He was focused on the technical details, on ensuring that the camera footage was backed up and protected against loss or damage. The footage we had obtained, combined with the tracks we had documented, the damaged clothing and mining equipment we had found in the mines, and Robert's grandfather's journal, created a compelling if not scientifically irrefutable case for the existence of something extraordinary in the Appalachian Mountains. I spent the evening preparing a comprehensive report. I compiled all of our findings into a document that would be suitable for submission to academic institutions and media outlets. Michael assisted, offering historical context and interpretations. We worked late into the night, creating a narrative that would explain everything we had experienced to people who had not been present. But even as we worked, I was aware that we were running out of time. The creature had been wounded by Abigail's shot. We did not know how serious the injury was, but animals that had been wounded frequently became more aggressive, more desperate, more dangerous. On the 10th day of our expedition, Jackson went missing. He had gone out alone to retrieve additional supplies from a cache we had established outside the town. When he did not return by evening, we organized a search. We found his body near the cache location, or what remained of it. The creature had been thorough. There was no question about what had happened, no room for ambiguity or alternative explanations. Jackson had been killed by something with tremendous strength and predatory efficiency. Elizabeth conducted a preliminary examination. Based on the pattern of injuries, she estimated that the creature had been moving on 2 legs, that its arm span and reach exceeded that of any known primate. The injuries suggested claws or talons in addition to manipulative appendages capable of grasping and tearing. We buried Jackson as best we could with the tools and time available to us. It was the second member of our group to be killed since we had entered the mountains. The realization that our presence in this place was directly resulting in deaths weighed heavily on all of us. That evening, I suggested evacuation. I said that we should gather our evidence and leave immediately, that we should reach the nearest city with news outlets and academic institutions and publicize our findings. Continuing to stay in the area seemed to serve no purpose beyond exposing ourselves to further danger. Abigail disagreed violently. She said that we had come too far, learned too much, to simply leave without completing our investigation. She said that Jackson and Sophia's deaths had to mean something, had to contribute toward some larger purpose. Michael was caught in the middle. He wanted to continue investigating, but he also understood the danger we were in. Ethan and Elizabeth sided with the evacuation plan. Logan, shaken by the death, agreed that leaving was the wisest course of action. We were deadlocked. We could not proceed as a unified group, and we could not separate without creating greater vulnerability. It was Robert who broke the impasse. He said that he would go with us to the nearest city, that he would help us publicize our findings and support our claims. He said that his grandfather's journal, combined with our evidence, might be enough to convince authorities to investigate the area more thoroughly. Abigail still wanted to continue investigations, but she could see that she was isolated in that position. After an intense conversation in which she expressed her anger and frustration, she agreed to the evacuation plan. We prepared to leave the next morning. We packed our evidence carefully, ensuring that the camera equipment was protected and that our documentation materials would survive the journey. We gathered what supplies we could carry and prepared for a full day of hiking that would take us out of the mountain region and toward civilization. But the creature had not finished with us. We did not make it far from the town before we encountered evidence that it was tracking us. We found massive prints along our route, prints that suggested the creature was paralleling our movement, staying just out of sight but monitoring our progress. The creature was no longer hunting us in the conventional sense of rapid pursuit and direct attack. It was stalking, maintaining distance, waiting for an opportunity. We were moving slower now because we were carrying supplies and because we were tired and traumatized. The creature understood advantage. At midday, while we were passing through a dense section of forest, the creature attacked. It came from the side, moving with shocking speed. Its target appeared to be Abigail. They collided with tremendous force, and Abigail went down beneath something that was clearly too large and too powerful for her to resist. The rest of us reacted immediately. Michael fired his rifle. Ethan swung his camera case like a weapon. I moved toward Abigail with the only thought in my mind being that I had to help her. The creature shrieked again, that same sound that was half scream and half animal vocalization. It had been hit by Michael's shot, had been struck in the shoulder or chest. It released Abigail, who rolled away from it, bleeding but apparently not fatally wounded. The creature moved toward Michael, moving with lethal purpose. Logan fired his rifle. The shot struck the creature in the leg, and the creature changed direction, moving toward the forest depths instead of continuing to pursue us. We did not pursue. We gathered Abigail, confirmed that while she was badly hurt, she was alive, and continued moving as quickly as possible toward the edge of the mountains. Abigail had been right about one thing. The creature had learned to fear our weapons. The injuries we had inflicted, while not fatal, had caused it pain and had motivated it to retreat. But we could not assume that it would not pursue us again, that it would not attempt to intercept us if it believed we were weakened or distracted. The rest of our journey out of the mountains was a nightmare of constant vigilance and exhaustion. We moved in daylight and sought defensible positions at night. Abigail's wounds required constant attention, and Emily worked tirelessly to keep her alive despite the severity of the injuries and the limitations of our medical supplies. On the evening of the 12th day of our expedition, we reached the edge of the mountains. Behind us, in the darkness, we could still hear sounds that suggested the creature was maintaining its pursuit. But it did not attack again. It seemed content to follow, to monitor our retreat, to ensure that we were truly leaving its territory. When we reached the town where we could access vehicles and contact authorities, the creature finally withdrew. The sounds ceased. The sense of being tracked and hunted dissipated. The thing that had pursued us relentlessly through the Appalachian wilderness seemed satisfied that we were beyond the boundaries of its domain. The story of our expedition did not have a clean ending, the kind of conclusion that provides closure and resolution. Instead, it ended with more questions than answers, more ambiguity than clarity. We filed reports with local authorities. We provided them with our evidence, the footage, the photographs, the documentation. The response was cautious and skeptical. Authorities conducted investigations into the disappearances we reported, into the deaths of Sophia, Jackson, and the injuries we had sustained. But they treated our reports as incidents caused by wildlife and environmental hazards rather than as evidence of something extraordinary. The footage we had captured was analyzed by experts who determined that it could not definitively prove the existence of an unknown creature. The images were too distorted, the lighting too poor, the motion too rapid. Experts argued that the footage could be explained by camera malfunctions, by filming of known animals in unusual conditions, by hoax. There was no consensus that what we had recorded was anything other than an explanation we had created to make sense of traumatic experiences. The clothes and equipment we had found in the mines were examined and dated. They were confirmed to be from various time periods spanning several decades. But authorities concluded that their presence in the mines was most easily explained by miners leaving equipment behind and by the natural accumulation of debris over time. The pattern that had seemed so sinister to us was reinterpreted as random distribution. Michael eventually published an article in an obscure academic journal detailing the historical accounts of missing miners and unusual occurrences in the Appalachian coal region. The article was reviewed with interest by historians but was largely ignored by the broader academic community. His conclusions were labeled as speculative and his evidence as circumstantial. Abigail recovered from her injuries, though she never fully regained mobility in her right arm. She became an advocate for further investigations of the mountains, writing articles and giving presentations about her experiences. But she found herself constantly marginalized by official institutions that had no framework for understanding what she was describing. Elizabeth published a comprehensive geological survey of the Blackwater Ridge region that documented the stability of the mine passages and the geological formations. Her work was professionally respected, but she carefully excluded any discussion of the creature or any interpretation of the phenomena that was not strictly geological. Ethan's footage was circulated on what might be called social media platforms, though in the context of the time, our ability to distribute it was limited. It generated interest among cryptozoology enthusiasts and amateur paranormal researchers, but it was dismissed by mainstream institutions as unreliable and anecdotal. Robert's grandfather's journal was eventually donated to a regional historical society, where it was catalogued as a personal memoir documenting the psychological and emotional impacts of mining work. Its accounts of the creature were labeled as folklore and superstition, the expressions of a traumatized man trying to make sense of occupational hazards and workplace tragedies. The mountains remain, and the mines remain. The caves and passages continue to exist, largely unmapped and largely unexplored by official expeditions. Hikers and campers continue to disappear in the region at rates that are somewhat elevated compared to national averages, but not so elevated as to prompt major investigations or increased security measures. I have spent years since the expedition trying to process what we experienced, trying to reconcile what I know I encountered with what the wider world is willing to acknowledge. I have come to understand that there are places on this earth that remain fundamentally unknowable, that resist the application of modern scientific frameworks and rational explanation. The creature exists. I am certain of this. Whether it is a natural phenomenon that our understanding of biology has not yet encompassed, or something that exists outside of the normal categories of nature, I cannot definitively say, but I am certain that it is real. The most troubling aspect of my experience is not the direct danger we faced, not the deaths of Sophia and Jackson, not the injuries we sustained. The most troubling aspect is the realization that the world is not as fully known as we have been taught to believe. There are mysteries that persist in the wild places, creatures that maintain existence in the margins of human awareness. If you are listening to this account, if you are sitting in the safety of your home listening to my words being read to you, I want you to understand something. The unknown is not safely contained in the past or in distant places. It persists at the edges of our civilization. It waits in the darkness beneath the earth and in the deep forests where human presence is minimal. I do not recommend exploring the Appalachian coal mines. I do not recommend camping in those mountains or venturing into the deep wilderness near Blackwater Ridge. There are reasons that the old stories exist, reasons that the Appalachian people developed their folklore and their warnings. Some places are better left unexplored. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures, despite their reality and their undeniable existence, are better left undisturbed in the darkness where they have always lived. That is the final truth that my expedition taught me. Not all knowledge is worth the cost of acquiring it. Not all mysteries improve our lives by being solved. The creature remains in the mountains, and I remain here, at a distance, with the knowledge of what exists beyond the boundaries of what society is willing to accept as real. The Breaking Neist, the Carrier CTA.